The letter arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday morning with no return address, only her name written in trembling black ink. Evelyn Marrow hadn't stepped foot in Blackwater for 15 years. Not since the funeral, not since the fire, not since the night screams echoed beneath Blackwood Manor. She told herself the past was buried, but inside the envelope was a single sentence that changed everything. Blackwood Manor is not empty. By midnight, she was on the last train back to the village she swore she would never see again. And somewhere beneath the cliffs, something was already waiting for her return. The letter beneath the floorboards' rain moved across the coastline in slow gray sheets as the train cut through the cliffs above Blackwater Bay. Evelyn Marrow sat alone near the back carriage, her gloved hands resting tightly over the leather satchel in her lap. Outside the fogged window, the sea crashed violently against black rocks 30 feet below, white foam vanishing into darkness each time the train curved inland. The conductor had stopped asking if she wanted tea nearly an hour ago. Most passengers were asleep, or pretending to be. Evelyn hadn't slept properly in 6 nights, not since the letter arrived. She reached into her coat pocket again, though she already knew every fold of the paper by memory now. The envelope had no return address. Only her name written in dark ink. Evelyn Marrow, nothing else. Inside had been a single sentence. Blackwood Manor is not empty, no signature, no explanation, just those 5 words. And somehow, against all reason, she had boarded a train back to the village she swore she would never see again. A sharp tremor rolled through the carriage. Somewhere ahead, metal screeched. Passengers stirred. A child whimpered softly. Evelyn looked out again. The cliffs were disappearing behind thick fog now. The world outside looked erased, endless gray swallowing everything. She pressed her thumb against the old silver ring on her finger, a nervous habit she hated, and closed her eyes briefly. Blackwood. 15 years. 15 years since her mother's funeral. 15 years since she walked out of Blackwood Manor in the middle of a storm and never returned. And yet the house had never truly left her. Some nights she still dreamed of its hallways, the creaking staircase, the smell of wet wood and candle smoke, and the locked room on the 3rd floor. A sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're heading to Blackwater?" Evelyn looked up sharply. The man across the aisle leaned slightly toward her, late 40s perhaps, narrow face, heavy wool coat damp from travel, a newspaper folded beneath one arm. His expression carried the cautious friendliness of small-town people who already suspected the answer. "I am," Evelyn said carefully. The man nodded once. "Not many people travel there this time of year." His eyes drifted toward the storm outside, especially tonight. Evelyn offered no response. Silence stretched. Then he asked casually, "Family there?" The question tightened something inside her chest. "Not anymore." The man seemed to regret asking. He cleared his throat and unfolded his newspaper again, though Evelyn noticed he didn't actually read it. The train lights flickered. For half a second, the carriage dimmed into darkness. And in that brief reflection against the window, Evelyn thought she saw someone standing behind her seat. Tall, still, watching. She turned instantly. Nothing, only sleeping passengers and swaying shadows. Her pulse quickened anyway. The train finally began slowing as distant harbor lights appeared through the fog. Blackwater Station, the old village by the sea, the place people left but rarely returned to. The brakes screamed against wet tracks. Outside, rain hammered the platform roof. And Evelyn suddenly felt the unmistakable certainty that returning here had been a terrible mistake. Blackwater smelled exactly the same. Salt, rain, smoke from old chimneys. The station platform was nearly empty except for one potter smoking beneath the awning and a woman dragging two soaked suitcases toward the taxi stand. Evelyn stepped off the train and immediately regretted not bringing heavier gloves. The cold bit through her sleeves sharply. The village beyond the station looked frozen in time. Narrow streets, dark stone buildings, warm yellow lights behind rain-covered windows. A church bell echoed somewhere in the distance. For one strange moment, memory overlapped perfectly with reality. She was 22 again, standing here after burying her mother. Heartbroken, furious, alone. "Miss!" Evelyn turned. A taxi driver leaned from an idling black cab nearby. "You need a ride?" She hesitated, then quietly said, "Blackwood Manor." The driver's expression changed immediately. Not fear exactly, recognition. "Oh." He glanced toward the cliffs above town, then back at her. "You family?" Evelyn almost lied, but something about the village made dishonesty feel dangerous. "I used to live there." The driver stared another second before stepping out to load her bag into the trunk. Rain drummed loudly against the cab roof once they started moving uphill through the village roads. Most shops were closed now. A bakery still glowed faintly near the harbor. The old cinema stood abandoned beside the square, its broken marquee hanging crooked in the wind. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, except the darkness. That felt larger somehow. "You been gone long?" the driver asked. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "People still talk about that house." Evelyn stared ahead. "I'm sure they do." The driver adjusted his mirror carefully. "You heard about what happened last winter?" Her stomach tightened. "No. A couple boys broke in during a storm." He paused. "One of them swore someone was living there." Evelyn said nothing. "Town figured it was nonsense," he continued, "until the other boy disappeared." The windshield wipers scraped loudly across the glass, back and forth, back and forth. Evelyn felt cold spread slowly through her arms. "Disappeared? Never found him." The driver lowered his voice unconsciously. "They searched the woods, the cliffs, even the water. And nothing." Rain batted harder now as the road climbed along the forest edge. Pine trees bent violently in the wind. Black branches scraped the sky. Then finally, Blackwood Manor emerged through the fog. Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment. The house stood above the cliffs like a shadow preserved from another century. Tall black windows, sharp gables, stone walls darkened by rain. Parts of the roof sagged slightly now, but the structure itself remained stubbornly alive against the storm. The sight of it dragged old memories violently to the surface. Her mother playing piano downstairs. Candles during power outages. Whispers behind closed doors. The night Evelyn heard someone crying inside the walls. The taxi slowed near the rusted front gate. "You sure you want to stay here tonight?" the driver asked quietly. Evelyn stared at the manor. One upstairs window reflected lightning briefly, and for the smallest fraction of a second, she thought she saw movement, a silhouette crossing the glass. Her breath caught, but the light vanished immediately. Only darkness remained. The driver noticed her expression. "What is it?" "Nothing." But her voice sounded thin, uncertain. The gate groaned loudly as she pushed it open. Rust flaked beneath her fingers. The gravel path beyond was nearly swallowed by weeds now. The taxi driver got out reluctantly and carried her bag to the front steps. "You got electricity at least?" he asked. "I don't know." "That's comforting." Despite herself, Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. The driver hesitated before leaving. "Listen." He rubbed rain from his forehead. "Town's got a diner open late if you change your mind. Harbor Road, Maggie's place." "Thank you." He nodded once, then lowered his voice. "If you hear anything tonight," Evelyn looked at him, "don't go looking for it." The taxi disappeared down the hill moments later, leaving her completely alone with the manor. Wind moved through the dead hedges softly. The house loomed overhead in silence, waiting. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket for the old brass key she hadn't touched in 15 years. Her hand trembled slightly. The lock resisted at first, then clicked open. The front door drifted inward slowly, and the smell hit her instantly. Dust, mildew, old wood, and beneath it faintly lavender perfume, her mother's perfume. Evelyn froze in the doorway. Impossible. The air inside felt cold enough to preserve ghosts. Lightning flashed across the entry hall. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like silent figures in the dark. The grandfather clock near the staircase remained stopped at 2:17, exactly as it had been 15 years ago. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The house remembered everything, and somehow so did she. The electricity still worked. Barely. Several lamps flickered weakly after Evelyn found the breaker box near the kitchen. The light only made the manor feel stranger. Dust coated nearly every surface, yet certain objects looked untouched. A silver tray on the dining table, a candle near the stairs, a chair slightly pulled away from the fireplace, as if someone had left the room moments earlier. Evelyn moved carefully through the first floor, removing sheets from furniture one by one. The silence pressed heavily around her. Even the storm outside sounded distant beneath the weight of the house. In the kitchen, she found old copper pans hanging exactly where her mother kept them, a cracked teacup near the sink, and beside the window, fresh cigarette ash. Evelyn stopped cold, not old, fresh. Her eyes narrowed slowly. Someone had been here, recently. The realization sent unease crawling beneath her skin. She stepped backward instinctively and glanced toward the dark hallway behind her. Empty, but the feeling remained, being watched. She opened drawers carefully. Most were empty. Until she found a single matchbox beside the stove. Local brand, still used in town, not 15 years old, very recent. Thunder shook the windows violently overhead. Evelyn inhaled slowly. Think, someone could have broken in. Teenagers maybe, drifters. The house had been abandoned for years. That explanation should have comforted her. It didn't, because abandoned houses did not smell faintly of lavender perfume. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Evelyn's head snapped upward instantly. Silence. Then another creak, slow, measured, not the random shifting of old wood. Footsteps above her. Her pulse slammed hard against her ribs. Hello? Nothing, only rain, wind, and somewhere upstairs another creak. Evelyn grabbed the heavy iron fireplace poker leaning beside the hearth. Ridiculous, but necessary. She moved toward the staircase slowly, every instinct telling her to leave immediately. The stairs groaned beneath her weight as she climbed. Second floor hallway, dark portraits lining the walls. Faded wallpaper peeling at the corners, the same long corridor from her childhood nightmares. Lightning illuminated the windows briefly, then darkness swallowed everything again. Evelyn tightened her grip on the poker. "Who's there?" Silence. One bedroom door near the far end stood slightly open. She approached carefully. The air felt colder here, sharp, almost wet. The door moved slightly with the draft. Evelyn pushed it wider. Empty room, dust-covered bed, broken mirror, nothing else. She exhaled slowly. Then froze, a sound behind her, breathing, very close. Evelyn spun around violently, no one. But at the end of the hallway, the third-floor staircase door stood open. Her stomach dropped. She was certain it had been closed earlier. Darkness waited beyond it. The third floor, the part of the manor her mother forbade her from entering as a child. The part Evelyn avoided even as an adult. Especially after the night she heard screaming up there. Another lightning flash illuminated the staircase briefly. And for one horrifying second, she saw muddy footprints leading upward, fresh footprints. Then darkness returned. Evelyn stood completely still. Every rational thought urged her to leave. Now, immediately, instead she found herself stepping slowly toward the stairs, one step, then another. The wood creaked beneath her shoes. The smell changed as she climbed. Less dust, more damp earth, like wet soil after rain. The third-floor hallway emerged slowly from darkness. Narrow, low ceiling. Old storage trunks lining the walls, and at the far end the locked door, still there, still black, still untouched. Evelyn stared at it as memories surfaced sharply. Her mother standing outside that room late at night, whispering to someone inside, the sound of crying, the smell of smoke. And one sentence her mother once said that Evelyn never forgot. "Some doors are closed for love, not fear." A sudden slam echoed downstairs. Evelyn jumped violently. The front door. Someone had entered the house. Her heartbeat thundered now. Slow footsteps moved below, not hiding, not sneaking, deliberate. Then a man's voice drifted upward through the manor. Calm, low. "Evelyn!" She froze instantly. Only one person in Blackwater ever sounded like that. Impossible. Her throat tightened painfully. The voice came again. "Evelyn!" She moved toward the staircase slowly, pulse roaring in her ears. And when she finally looked down into the second-floor hallway below, she saw him standing near the staircase. Tall. Dark coat soaked from rain, one hand resting against the banister. Lucas Thorne, the last man she ever expected to see again. Older now, hotter around the eyes, but unmistakably Lucas. The man she left behind 15 years ago without a goodbye. He looked up at her silently. Shock flickered across his face first, then something colder, something wounded. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the floorboards. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Lucas said quietly, "You shouldn't have come back here." And somewhere deep inside the manor, a woman screamed. The room above the hallway, the scream lasted only a second, but it tore through Blackwood Manor like something alive. Evelyn felt every muscle in her body lock. Lucas moved instantly. "Stay there," he snapped. Then he was already climbing the staircase 2 steps at a time. The old wood groaned violently beneath him. Evelyn stood frozen for half a heartbeat before instinct overcame shock and she followed. Rain slammed against the manor windows. Thunder rolled over the cliffs outside. Lucas reached the second floor first, turning sharply toward the eastern hallway. "Did you hear where it came from?" Evelyn asked breathlessly. He didn't answer. His jaw looked tight, focused. Like this wasn't the first terrible sound he'd heard inside this house. That realization unsettled her more than the scream itself. The hallway seemed darker now somehow. The lamps downstairs flickered weakly beneath the storm, throwing moving shadows across the walls. Lucas stopped suddenly beside the old study door. Another sound drifted from somewhere deeper inside the manor, not screaming this time. Crying. Soft, unsteady. Evelyn's blood turned cold. She knew that sound, not because she recognized the voice, because she remembered hearing it before, years ago, late at night, inside the walls. Lucas pushed the study door open sharply. The room was empty. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls. Rain rattled the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble, but the crying continued, faint now, somewhere above them. Lucas looked toward the ceiling slowly. Third floor. Evelyn immediately stepped backward. "No," Lucas glanced at her. "You know something." It wasn't a question. She shook her head too quickly. "No, the sound's coming from upstairs." "I know where it's coming from." That stopped him. For a moment, only rain filled the silence between them. Lucas studied her face carefully now. Older memories moved behind his eyes. Shared memories. "You never told me what happened up there," he said quietly. Evelyn looked away first because she couldn't, not then, not now. The crying stopped abruptly. Complete silence followed. Lucas moved toward the hallway again. "This house isn't safe," Evelyn whispered. He almost laughed at that. "No," he said softly. "It never was." Another loud creak echoed overhead. Movement. Lucas cursed under his breath and headed toward the third-floor staircase. Evelyn grabbed his arm instinctively. The contact startled both of them. Warmth shot unexpectedly through her chest. Familiar, dangerous. Lucas looked down at her hand, then at her. 15 years vanished for one unbearable second. "You can't go up there alone," she said quietly. Something shifted behind his eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but something softer than anger. Then he pulled free gently. "Then don't fall behind." The third floor smelled worse tonight. Damp wood, old smoke, and beneath it something metallic, like rust or blood. Lucas moved ahead with a flashlight he'd taken from his coat pocket. The narrow beam swept across peeling wallpaper and old furniture draped beneath dusty sheets. Evelyn stayed close despite herself. The storm outside had intensified now. Wind howled around the roof sharply enough to sound almost human. The locked black door waited at the end of the hallway, exactly where Evelyn remembered, exactly as she remembered. Lucas stopped when he noticed her staring at it. "You know what's in there?" "No," a lie, not entirely, but enough. Lucas stepped closer to the door, flashlight tracing over the old brass lock. "Someone's been here recently." Evelyn frowned. "What?" He pointed downward. Fresh scratches marked the wood near the lock. Tiny fragments of metal glittered on the floorboards. Someone had tried to force it open. Recently, the crying sound returned suddenly, closer now, right behind the walls. Evelyn flinched hard. Lucas looked toward the ceiling again, then slowly toward the wall beside the locked room. "There's space back there," he muttered. Evelyn stared. "What do you mean? The architecture doesn't make sense." He swept the flashlight carefully along the hallway. "This wall should connect to the west side windows, but it doesn't." A hidden space. Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. Childhood memories surfaced instantly. Her mother disappearing upstairs for hours, strange knocking sounds behind walls. The night Evelyn woke to footsteps moving inside the ceiling above her bedroom. Lucas crouched near the baseboards, then frowned. "There!" A narrow seam in the wallpaper, almost invisible. He pressed against it. Part of the wall shifted inward slightly with a dull wooden click. Evelyn stopped breathing. a hidden door slowly opened into darkness. Cold air drifted outward immediately, and the smell, wet earth, mold, rotting wood. Lucas lifted the flashlight. A narrow passage stretched beyond the wall. Old stone steps descended into darkness beneath the manor. "What the hell?" Evelyn whispered. Lucas looked grim. "You didn't know about this?" "No." But again, memory betrayed her, because deep down some part of her had always known. The crying sound echoed faintly from below, not upstairs, underneath them. Lucas stepped toward the hidden staircase, then paused. "You don't have to come." Evelyn almost agreed immediately. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'm not staying up here alone." For the first time since arriving, Lucas smiled slightly. It disappeared almost instantly, but she saw it, and somehow that hurt worse. The passage beneath Blackwood Manor was older than the house itself. Stone walls curved tightly around them as they descended. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead. The flashlight beam shook slightly in Lucas's hand, not from fear, Evelyn realized, but from anger. He was furious she'd returned, and perhaps even more furious that part of him still cared. The realization sat heavily between them. The staircase finally opened into a narrow underground corridor, ancient, cold. The air tasted like rainwater and decay. Evelyn wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "What is this place?" Lucas moved the flashlight across the walls. "Smuggling tunnels, probably. Most houses near the cliffs had them once." The corridor stretched ahead beneath arched stone ceilings blackened with age, and then Evelyn saw something that stopped her cold. Candles, recently burned candles, wax still soft. Someone was living here. Lucas noticed them too. His expression darkened immediately. "We're not alone." The crying sound came again, closer, this time unmistakably human. A woman, weak, frightened. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Someone needs help." Lucas grabbed her wrist before she could move forward. "All wants us to think they do." Footsteps echoed suddenly somewhere deeper in the tunnel, fast, running. Lucas killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed them whole. Evelyn's breathing became painfully loud. The footsteps stopped. Silence, then a scraping sound nearby, very close. Evelyn felt Lucas pull her backward against the wall. His hand covered her mouth gently, warm, steady. She could feel his heart beat through his coat sleeve. Strong. Controlled, the darkness pressed around them. Then a faint glow appeared ahead, a lantern moving slowly through the tunnel. Someone was coming toward them. Evelyn strained to see. A figure emerged gradually from the dark, tall, thin, wrapped in a heavy coat. The lantern light illuminated pale fingers gripping the handle tightly. Then the figure stopped suddenly, as if sensing them. Silence stretched. Neither side moved. And then the lantern went out. Complete darkness again. Footsteps exploded through the tunnel. Running away, Lucas released Evelyn instantly and sprinted off to the sound. "Lucas!" Her voice echoed uselessly through the underground passage. She chased off to him blindly, one hand dragging against the cold stone wall. The tunnel twisted sharply, then widened into an enormous underground chamber beneath the manor. Evelyn stumbled to a stop. The flashlight beam swept wildly across the room as Lucas searched the darkness. Old furniture, crates, blankets, a small iron stove. Someone had been living down here. Recently, very recently. Lucas moved carefully through the chamber, then froze. Evelyn saw it too. Photographs pinned across the far wall. Dozens of them, all of Blackwater village, the harbour, the church, the cemetery, the cliffs, and in the centre photographs of Evelyn, recent photographs. Evelyn standing outside her apartment in London. Evelyn entering bookstores. Evelyn sitting alone in cafes. Her blood ran ice cold. Someone had been watching her for months. Lucas pulled one photo from the wall. His expression hardened dangerously. "When did you start getting the letters?" Evelyn stared at him. "You knew." He looked at her sharply. "How many?" "3." Lucas swore softly under his breath. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Who would I tell?" He stepped closer now. "Me." The word landed harder than it should have. Before Evelyn could answer, a sound echoed from the opposite side of the chamber, a door closing. Lucas spun instantly and ran toward the far tunnel. Evelyn followed. The passage beyond narrowed sharply before opening into another stone room. Smaller, colder, and empty except for one wooden chair positioned beneath a hanging light bulb. The bulb swung slowly, as if someone had just left. On the chair sat a small black box. Lucas approached carefully. Evelyn noticed the wire first, thin, nearly invisible, connected beneath the chair. Lucas, too late. The floor exploded beneath them. Wood shattered violently upward. Evelyn felt herself falling as darkness swallowed everything. Beneath the cliffside chapel, the fall lasted only seconds, but in the dark, it felt endless. Evelyn hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Cold water surged around her legs instantly, soaking through her coat. Somewhere nearby, wood crashed into stone. Then silence. Total darkness. For one terrifying moment, she couldn't move. Pain radiated sharply through her shoulder. Above her, distant debris continued falling through the broken floorboards. "Lucas?" No answer. Panic rose immediately. "Lucas?" A groan echoed somewhere to her left. Relief hit so suddenly it almost hurt. Then a flashlight flickered weakly through the dark. Lucas lay half-submerged in shallow water several feet away, one arm braced painfully against the stone wall. "You alive?" he muttered. "Barely." "That's encouraging." Despite everything, Evelyn almost laughed. The flashlight beam trembled as Lucas stood carefully. Blood ran from a cut near his temple, disappearing into rainwater pooling across the underground floor. The chamber around them looked ancient. Natural stone walls curved overhead like a cave beneath the cliffs. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Evelyn looked upward. The hole they'd fallen through was nearly invisible now, swallowed by darkness 20 feet above. "We need another route out," Lucas said. His voice sounded strained. "You're hurt." "I've been worse." He immediately regretted saying it. Evelyn heard the bitterness beneath the words. The years between them still lived inside everything unsaid. She pushed herself upright carefully. Cold spread through her soaked clothes instantly. "What was that room?" Lucas swept the flashlight across the cavern slowly. "A trap. No one builds traps beneath abandoned houses." "No," he agreed quietly. "They don't." The light passed over something metallic near the far wall. Chains. Old rusted chains bolted into stone. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Then she saw scratches carved into the wall nearby, dozens of them, vertical lines, counting days. The realization made her skin crawl. Someone had once been kept down here. Lucas moved closer to inspect them. "Some of these are recent." Evelyn stared sharply. "What?" He pointed toward fresher marks cut into the stone, not decades old. "Weeks. Maybe days." A cold draft moved through the cavern suddenly, carrying faint air from somewhere deeper underground. Lucas noticed it too. There, a narrow opening hidden behind fallen rocks. The passage beyond sloped upward into darkness. Evelyn glanced once more at the chains before following him. Rainwater dripped steadily behind them as they entered the tunnel. The passage twisted beneath the cliffs for what felt like miles, sometimes so narrow they had to move sideways through the stone, sometimes opening into larger chambers filled with collapsed beams and flooded ground. Lucas walked ahead quietly, flashlight scanning constantly. Evelyn stayed close behind, not because she trusted the tunnels, because she trusted being alone even less. The silence between them thickened with every step. Finally, Lucas spoke without looking back. "You disappeared." Not angry now, just tired. Evelyn looked down at the wet stone beneath her feet. "Yes, you could have written." "I tried." He stopped walking, turned slowly toward her. The flashlight illuminated sharp exhaustion across his face. "You tried?" Evelyn swallowed. "There were letters. I never got them." The tunnel fell silent again except for distant dripping water. Lucas studied her carefully, and for the first time since seeing him again, she noticed something beneath his anger. Hurt, real hurt. 15 years old and still bleeding quietly inside him. "You left without saying goodbye," he said softly. "You think I don't know that? Then why?" Evelyn looked away, because the truth still terrified her, because Blackwood Manor had destroyed her mother, because she'd spent years afraid it would destroy her too, and because the last thing her mother whispered before dying still haunted every quiet moment of her life. "Don't let the house keep you." A sudden sound interrupted the silence ahead. Footsteps. Lucas killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed them again. The footsteps were faint, but definitely there, somewhere further up the tunnel, moving away. Lucas leaned close enough for Evelyn to feel his breath near her ear. "Stay behind me." Then he moved forward silently through the dark. The tunnel curved sharply upward before ending at an old wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Faint candlelight glowed beneath it. Lucas carefully pressed one eye against the crack. His body stiffened instantly. "What is it?" Evelyn whispered. He looked back at her slowly. "There's someone inside." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Who?" "I don't know." The footsteps inside stopped. Then a woman's voice spoke softly. "You can stop hiding now." Lucas and Evelyn froze. The voice continued calmly. "I know you're there." Lucas tightened his grip on the flashlight, then pushed the door open sharply. Warm candlelight flooded over them. The room beyond looked impossibly strange after the darkness underground. Small, stone-walled, furnished like a hidden chapel. Candles flickered across old wooden pews. A fireplace burned softly near the far wall, and seated calmly beside it was a woman Evelyn recognized instantly. Margaret Vale, Blackwater's former librarian, or rather, former librarian presumed dead 3 years ago. Evelyn stopped breathing. Margaret looked older now, thinner, gray streaks through dark hair, but unmistakably alive. Lucas stared in disbelief. "You're supposed to be dead." Margaret gave a tired smile. "That was the intention." Rain thundered faintly overhead somewhere beyond the cliffs. Evelyn stepped forward slowly. "Why are you hiding down here?" Margaret's eyes moved toward her carefully. "You came back." Not surprise, recognition, as though she had expected this eventually. Evelyn's voice hardened. "You sent the letters." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a kettle hanging over the fire. "You both look freezing." Lucas remained standing, rigid, dangerously alert. "Start talking." Margaret sighed softly. You always were impatient, and you always avoided direct answers. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Regret, perhaps. She poured tea slowly into 3 mismatched cups. The smell of lavender filled the room. Evelyn went completely still. The same scent from the manor, Margaret noticed. Your mother liked lavender tea before bed. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. You knew my mother. We all knew your mother. The way she said it felt wrong somehow. Careful. Measured. Lucas remained near the door. You faked your death. Margaret nodded once. Yes. Why? Her expression darkened. Because people started disappearing. Silence. The fire crackled softly. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. Margaret set 1 cup before Evelyn. You remember Daniel Corbett? Evelyn frowned. The name stirred something distant. A fisherman? Lucas answered first. He vanished 9 years ago. Margaret nodded. Then Clara Bennett. Then the Mercer boy last winter. Evelyn looked at her sharply. The teenager who disappeared from Blackwood Manor. Margaret's eyes held hers. He didn't disappear. A long silence followed. Lucas stepped forward slowly. What happened to him? Margaret looked toward the fire. They took him. Cold spread through Evelyn instantly. They? Margaret finally lifted her gaze again, and for the first time Evelyn saw genuine fear there, not paranoia, not madness, fear, the people living beneath Blackwood. The room went silent. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Lucas stared at her. There's nobody living beneath Blackwood Manor. Margaret gave a hollow smile. That's what they want the village to believe. Evelyn shook her head slowly. This is insane. Is it? Margaret asked quietly. Then she stood and crossed toward a wooden cabinet near the wall. From inside, she removed an old photograph. Faded, water-damaged. She handed it carefully to Evelyn. The moment Evelyn saw the image, her blood turned to ice. It showed Blackwood Manor nearly 40 years earlier. Several people stood outside the entrance. One of them was Evelyn's mother, much younger, smiling faintly. Beside her stood a tall man in a dark coat, and behind them, half hidden near an upstairs window, was the face of a child staring down from inside the manor. A pale child with hollow eyes. Evelyn's hands trembled. Who is that? Margaret answered quietly. That, she said, is the reason your mother was terrified of the 3rd floor. Lucas took the photograph slowly. His expression changed as he studied it. There's something written on the back. Evelyn turned it over. Faded ink stretched across the paper. Only 4 words remained readable. She heard them breathing. A loud crash suddenly echoed somewhere above the chapel ceiling. All 3 of them froze. Another crash followed. Closer this time, Lucas immediately killed the lamps. Darkness swallowed the room except for the firelight. Heavy footsteps moved overhead. Multiple people. Margaret whispered sharply, "They found you." Evelyn's pulse slammed violently. Lucas moved toward the tunnel entrance. How many exits? Margaret's face had gone pale. Only one. Then the chapel door upstairs exploded open. Voices echoed through the stone ceiling, male voices, searching. One of them shouted, "Check below," and another voice answered, "She's here somewhere." The man in the harbor coat, Margaret, moved first. Faster than Evelyn expected from someone who had spent years hiding underground. She crossed the chapel in 3 quick steps and shoved aside one of the wooden pews, revealing a narrow hatch beneath the floorboards. "Hurry!" Lucas didn't move. His attention remained fixed upward toward the ceiling where heavy footsteps echoed above them. 3 people at least, maybe more. The old chapel groaned as furniture scraped across the floor overhead. They were searching carefully, methodically, not random intruders, people who knew this place existed. Evelyn knelt beside the hatch. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Another tunnel. Of course, there was another tunnel. Blackwood Manor suddenly felt less like a house and more like the center of some enormous buried thing spreading beneath the entire village. Lucas finally crouched beside Margaret. Where does this go? The cliffs. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. A loud bang exploded above them. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. Someone upstairs shouted, "Down here!" Margaret's expression tightened sharply. "They're closer than I thought." Lucas grabbed the lantern from the table. "You first," he told Evelyn. She stared into the darkness beneath the hatch. Every instinct screamed not to climb deeper underground. Then another violent crash echoed overhead. Decision made. Evelyn lowered herself into the narrow shaft. The stone ladder was slick with moisture. Her shoes slipped twice before reaching solid ground below. Lucas followed immediately behind her. Margaret dropped down lost and pulled the hatch shut overhead. Darkness swallowed them except for the weak lantern glow. The tunnel here was narrower than the others, rougher, less like old smuggling passages and more like natural caves carved through rock beneath the cliffs. The sound of the ocean echoed faintly somewhere ahead. Margaret moved quickly despite the uneven ground. "They won't stop now," she whispered. Lucas kept pace beside her. "Who are they?" Margaret said nothing. Evelyn noticed that. Every time the question came directly, Margaret avoided it. Not couldn't answer. Wouldn't. The tunnel curved sharply downward before widening into a cavern lined with old wooden beams. Several small boats rested beside black seawater pooled beneath the rock, an underground harbor. Evelyn stared in disbelief. "This connects to the bay?" Margaret nodded. "During storms, smugglers used these tunnels to move supplies beneath the cliffs." Lucas swept the lantern across the cavern. Recent footprints covered the muddy ground. Some large, some small, too many. Evelyn noticed something else. Children's drawings pinned along one wooden support beam, faded crayon sketches, houses, trees, faces, and over again the manor. Her chest tightened painfully. Margaret, the older woman, refused to look at the drawings. "They're old." "How old?" No answer. A sound echoed faintly through the tunnel behind them. Voices. Closer now. Lucas immediately extinguished the lantern. Darkness crashed over them. Evelyn heard Margaret's breathing quicken beside her. Then came the unmistakable sound of boots against stone. The searchers had found the tunnel. Lucas leaned close. "We take the boats." Margaret whispered sharply, "No, why not? They'll see us from the water." Another voice echoed behind them, very close now. "Spread out," Lucas cursed softly. There was no time. He relit the lantern briefly and grabbed one of the smaller boats tied beside the underground dock. "Help me." Evelyn pulled at the rope while Margaret hesitated, then suddenly froze, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the water. Evelyn followed her gaze. At first she saw nothing, then movement, a figure standing silently across the cavern, watching them, tall, motionless, almost entirely swallowed by darkness except for pale hands visible against a long black coat. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The figure tilted its head slightly, then stepped backward into darkness and vanished completely. "What the hell was that?" Lucas whispered. Margaret looked terrified now. "Go," she said urgently. "Now." The voices behind them grew louder. Flashlights flickered somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Lucas shoved the boat into the black water hard enough to splash freezing spray across Evelyn's legs. "Get in." She climbed inside shakily. Margaret followed. Lucas untied the final rope just as flashlight beams appeared behind the cavern entrance. "There!" someone shouted. The boat drifted violently into darkness as Lucas grabbed the oars. A beam of light swept across the cavern walls, then across the water, then directly onto Evelyn's face. "Stop them!" A gunshot exploded through the cavern. Stone shattered beside the boat. Evelyn ducked instinctively. Lucas rowed harder. The underground waterway narrowed sharply ahead, disappearing into a black tunnel barely wide enough for the boat. Another shot rang out. Margaret cried out suddenly. Evelyn turned sharply. Blood spread across Margaret's sleeve. "She's hit. Keep your head down," Lucas barked. The boat slammed into the tunnel entrance, scraping violently against stone before finally sliding through into darkness beyond. The gunfire stopped. Only the sound of water remained now, and Margaret strained breathing. The tunnel eventually opened into the sea beneath the cliffs. Rain hammered the water violently outside. Blackwater Bay stretched beneath endless darkness, waves crashing against jagged rocks around them. Lucas rowed hard through the storm while Evelyn pressed her scarf against Margaret's bleeding arm. "It went through clean," Evelyn whispered. Margaret looked pale, but not deep. The older woman winced against the pain, then grabbed Evelyn's wrist suddenly. "You can't trust anyone in Blackwater." Lightning flashed across the sea. For a moment, the cliffs illuminated beside them like enormous black walls. Evelyn looked toward the village above. Warm lights glowed faintly through the storm. It looked peaceful from here, normal, which somehow made everything worse. "Who are they?" Evelyn asked again. Margaret's eyes moved toward Blackwood Manor looming high above the cliffs. "They protect the house." Lucas looked back sharply. "Protect it from what?" Margaret's voice lowered. "From what's inside." Another wave slammed against the boat violently. Evelyn nearly lost her balance. The storm had worsened dramatically now. Rain blinded the harbor ahead. Lucas adjusted course toward a small cove beneath the village docks. "We'll lose them in town." Margaret shook her head weakly. "They already know she's back." Evelyn stared at her. "Who knows?" Margaret's eyes met hers carefully. "The ones your mother tried to stop." A deep cold spread through Evelyn's chest. "My mother wasn't trying to stop anyone." Margaret said nothing. That silence spoke louder than words. Lucas guided the boat beneath the old harbor pier where darkness concealed them from the cliffs above. The rain softened slightly here beneath the wooden structure. Evelyn helped Margaret onto the dock carefully. The older woman looked exhausted now. "You need a doctor." "No hospitals. You've been shot." Margaret gripped Evelyn's arm harder. "Listen to me carefully." Her voice shook slightly. "Did your mother ever tell you about the room beneath the greenhouse?" Evelyn frowned. "What greenhouse?" Margaret's expression changed instantly. Confusion, then realization. "Oh God, what? She never told you." Lucas stepped closer. "Told her what?" Margaret looked toward Blackwood Manor again. Fear hollowed her face. The manor was never the real problem. Thunder rolled over the harbor. Distant church bells echoed midnight through the storm, and then footsteps sounded above them on the pier. Slow, heavy, 3 sets. Lucas immediately pulled the lantern dark. Voices drifted through the rain overhead. Male voices. Searching, one of them spoke calmly. She couldn't have gone far. Evelyn froze. She recognized the voice instantly. Not from tonight, from childhood, from Blackwood Manor itself. The memory hit like ice water. A man standing beside her mother's coffin 15 years ago, tall, thin, gray coat, watching Evelyn without blinking. Lucas noticed her expression. "What is it?" Evelyn's voice barely emerged. "I know that voice." The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Silence. Then the man spoke again quietly. She came back exactly like her mother did. A long pause followed. And then, "This time, don't let her leave." Maggie's diner at midnight, the footsteps overhead moved slowly across the pier. Not hurried, not nervous, confident, as if the men searching the harbor already believed escape was impossible. Lucas kept one hand near Evelyn's shoulder, holding her still beneath the dock while rainwater dripped steadily around them. Margaret leaned weakly against one of the wooden supports, blood soaking through the scarf wrapped around her arm. The voice above came again. "Check the boats." Another answered immediately. "They'll head into town." "No," the first man said calmly. "She'll go back to the house." Evelyn felt cold spread through her stomach because part of him was right. Blackwood Manor had already begun pulling at her again, like unfinished grief, like a wound reopening. Lucas leaned close enough for her to hear him over the rain. "When I move, stay low. You have a plan?" "No." "That's reassuring." A faint smirk touched his mouth briefly, then vanished. The men overhead split apart, footsteps separating across the pier. Lucas waited. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then he moved, fast. He climbed silently onto the dock, disappearing into darkness above. Evelyn's pulse thundered painfully. A muffled grunt echoed overhead. Then another. Wood creaked violently. By the time Evelyn climbed up after him, 2 men already lay unconscious near stacks of fishing crates. Lucas stood over the third man with one arm twisted sharply behind his back. Rain drenched all 3 of them. The captured man grimaced in pain but didn't look frightened. That was the unsettling part. He looked almost amused. Lucas shoved him hard against the railing. "Who sent you?" The man smiled through bloody teeth. "You already know." Lucas tightened his grip. "I asked a question." "And I ignored it." Evelyn stared at the man carefully now, late 50s perhaps, broad shoulders beneath a dark harbor coat. Gray hair slicked against his forehead from rain. Something about him felt deeply familiar. Then she realized why. He had attended her mother's funeral, the same man, standing near the cemetery gates while everyone else left, watching, always watching. The man looked toward Evelyn directly. "You look just like her." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "My mother." His smile faded slightly. "No." That answer disturbed her more than if he'd threatened her. Lucas slammed him harder against the railing. "Enough games." The man barely reacted. "You think you understand what this place is." His eyes shifted toward Blackwood Manor high above the cliffs. "You don't." Margaret climbed shakily onto the dock behind them. The moment the man saw her, his expression changed. Not surprise, disappointment. "You should have stayed dead, Margaret." Margaret looked exhausted. "But then who would remember what you people did?" The man's jaw tightened. "Careful." "No," she whispered. "You be careful." Lucas stepped between them. "What did they do?" Neither answered immediately. Wind moved violently through the harbor. Fishing boats rocked against their ropes. Somewhere nearby, a church bell echoed once through the storm. The man finally looked at Evelyn again. "Your mother opened something she couldn't control." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "She told you nothing, didn't she?" Lucas punched him before Evelyn could answer. The man staggered hard against the railing. You don't speak to her again unless you answer directly. Blood mixed with rainwater down the man's chin, yet somehow he still looked calm. She'll find out eventually. Lucas hit him again, harder. Lucas, Evelyn snapped. He ignored her. Names? The man laughed softly through split lips. You think this ends with names. Another set of footsteps suddenly echoed from the far side of the pier. More searches. Lucas cursed under his breath. The man smiled wider now. There they are. Lucas knocked him unconscious instantly, then turned sharply toward Evelyn. We move now. Maggie's diner sat near the far end of Harbor Road beside the old bait shop. Warm yellow light glowed through fogged windows despite the late hour. The neon sign buzzed weakly against the storm. Evelyn remembered coming here as a teenager after school. Cheap coffee, burnt pie crust. Lucas sitting in the corner booth pretending not to watch her. That memory hurt more than expected. They slipped through the back entrance just before another wave of rain hit the harbor. The diner was nearly empty. Only 2 fishermen occupied a booth near the windows, speaking quietly over untouched coffee. An old radio played low jazz behind the counter, and Maggie herself stood near the kitchen pass through drying dishes with a towel. She looked up immediately. Froze. The plate slipped from her hands and shattered across the floor. Oh my God. Evelyn hadn't seen Maggie Holt in 15 years. The woman looked older now, heavier around the shoulders, gray streaking through dark curls. But the sharpness in her eyes remained exactly the same. Maggie stared at Evelyn like she'd seen a ghost, then at Lucas, then at Margaret's blood-soaked sleeve. Without asking a single question, Maggie locked the front door. Kitchen, she said quietly. Hurry. The back room smelled like coffee grounds and onion soup. Rain rattled against the kitchen windows while Maggie cleaned Margaret's wound with practiced efficiency. You still keep medical supplies in a diner? Lucas asked. Maggie didn't look up. In Blackwater, you learn to. Margaret winced as Maggie wrapped fresh bandages around her arm. Bullet passed clean through. You're lucky, Maggie muttered. No, Margaret replied softly. I'm late. Evelyn sat at the small prep table nearby trying to warm feeling back into her hands around a cup of coffee. Everything felt unreal. The tunnels, the photographs, the armed men, Margaret alive after years presumed dead, and Lucas beside her again after nearly half a lifetime. None of it felt stable enough to touch. Maggie finally looked toward Evelyn carefully. You shouldn't have come back. The words landed heavily. Not accusation. Fear. Evelyn stared into her coffee. I didn't plan to, but you came anyway. Yes, Maggie sighed, just like Alina. Evelyn looked up sharply. My mother came back too. Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Lucas leaned against the counter watching Maggie carefully now. The older woman finally nodded. 3 months before she died. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly. That's impossible. No, Maggie whispered. What's impossible is how much they erased afterward. Evelyn stood abruptly. What are you talking about? Maggie hesitated, then moved toward an old cabinet near the freezer. From inside, she removed a small wooden box wrapped carefully in cloth. Evelyn recognized it instantly. Her mother's handwriting covered the lid. A sharp ache hit her chest so unexpectedly she nearly sat back down. You had this, she whispered. Maggie placed the box gently on the table. Your mother left it with me the night she died. Lucas straightened immediately. What's inside? Maggie looked directly at Evelyn. She said only you should open it. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she untied the cloth wrapping. The box smelled faintly of lavender. Inside rested several objects, a silver key, a photograph, and a cassette tape labeled only with a date. October 14th, 1991. Evelyn picked up the photograph first. The image showed Blackwood Manor's greenhouse standing behind the estate, but something was wrong. The greenhouse no longer existed. Evelyn frowned. There was never a greenhouse. There was, Maggie said quietly, until the fire. Evelyn looked sharply toward her. What fire? No one answered immediately. Lucas stared at the photograph carefully, then at Evelyn. You really don't remember? Cold spread slowly through her body. Fragments surfaced suddenly. Smoke, sirens, her mother screaming her name, rain against windows, a little girl standing outside in the dark. Evelyn gripped the edge of the table hard. I was there. Maggie nodded slowly. Yes. Evelyn looked at the cassette tape. What's on this? Maggie's expression darkened. The truth. Thunder shook the diner windows violently. At the exact same moment someone knocked on the front door, all four of them froze. Another knock followed, slow, measured. Then a familiar male voice drifted through the diner. Evening, Maggie. Evelyn's blood turned cold instantly. The man from the pier. Maggie whispered sharply, turn off the kitchen light. Lucas moved instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. Outside, the man knocked again, this time louder. Then he said calmly, I know she's in there. The tape from 1991, no one moved. Rain hammered the diner windows while the man outside waited patiently beneath the neon glow. Not pounding now, not threatening, just standing there. Certain. Maggie slowly reached beneath the kitchen counter and pulled out a revolver wrapped in an old dish towel. Evelyn stared. You keep a gun in a diner too? Maggie checked the cylinder calmly. In Blackwater, you learn to. Lucas moved toward the small kitchen window overlooking the alley, carefully lifting the edge of the curtain. He's alone, he whispered. Margaret shook her head immediately. No, he is. As if proving her right, headlights suddenly swept across the front windows outside. Another vehicle pulling up. Then another. The diner's walls seemed to shrink around them. Evelyn's pulse thudded painfully. How many people are after us? Margaret answered quietly. Enough. The man outside spoke again. You know this ends badly, Maggie. Maggie's eyes narrowed. So does every funeral in this town. Silence followed. Then the sound of boots stepping onto the diner porch. Multiple people now. Lucas turned from the window. Back exit, Maggie nodded toward the storage hall, leads into the alley. We'll never outrun them in town, Margaret whispered. Lucas looked toward the cassette tape still sitting on the table. We don't need to outrun them. We need answers. The front door handle rattled suddenly. Once, twice, then harder. Evelyn grabbed the wooden box instinctively. Lucas looked at her sharply. Take the tape. What about you? I'll handle this. Before she could argue, the front glass shattered violently. A hand reached through the broken window toward the lock. Maggie fired instantly. The gunshot exploded through the diner like thunder. Someone outside screamed. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's wrist. Move. The alley behind Maggie's diner smelled like wet garbage and sea salt. Rain pawed hard enough to blur the streetlights as they ran between old brick buildings toward Harbor Lane. Behind them, shouting erupted inside the diner. More gunshots. Evelyn looked back instinctively. Lucas shoved her forward. Don't. But Maggie, she knows what she's doing. Margaret stumbled suddenly against the wall. The blood loss was catching up with her. Lucas caught her before she fell. "We need somewhere safe." "There isn't one," Margaret muttered weakly. Evelyn clutched the cassette tape tightly inside her coat pocket. "What's on this tape?" Margaret looked at her. "Your mother recorded it after the fire." Lightning flashed overhead. For one brief moment, the village illuminated around them, and Evelyn saw something that made her stop cold. A figure standing at the far end of the alley, tall, still, watching them through the rain, the same figure from the underground cavern, black coat, pale hands, motionless. Lucas saw it too. "Hey!" The figure turned instantly and disappeared into darkness between the buildings. Lucas swore softly. "They're hurting us." "What does that mean?" "It means every time we run, someone's already waiting." Another shout echoed behind them from the diner. Closer now, Margaret pointed toward the old church uphill. "There." Evelyn looked sharply. St. Jude's Chapel loomed above the village cemetery through the rain, dark, ancient. The same church where her mother's funeral had been held. "I'm not going back there." "You don't have a choice," Margaret whispered. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's arm gently. "We move now or we split up." The decision was immediate. They ran uphill through the storm. The church doors groaned open beneath Lucas's hands. Cold candle-scented air drifted out from inside. The chapel was empty except for rows of wooden pews and flickering red sanctuary lamps near the altar. Rain echoed softly against stained glass windows overhead. Margaret nearly collapsed into the front pew. Lucas locked the doors behind them, then turned sharply toward Evelyn. "The tape!" Her hands shook slightly as she removed it from her coat. Old cassette, slightly warped with age. The handwritten label trembled in her fingers. October 14th, 1991. The night of the fire. Margaret pointed toward a small office near the side hall. "Father Ben keeps an old recorder." Lucas disappeared into the office and returned moments later carrying a dusty cassette player. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Evelyn stared at the tape. Her mother's voice waited inside it. After 15 years, the thought alone made her chest ache. Lucas sat beside her quietly, not touching, close enough anyway. "You don't have to do this now," he said softly. Evelyn looked at him. "I left this place without answers once already." She inserted the tape, pressed play. Static crackled loudly through the empty church. Then her mother's voice emerged from the speaker, soft, breathless, terrified. "If you're hearing this, something has gone wrong." Evelyn stopped breathing. The voice sounded exactly the same, warm, intelligent, frightened in a way Evelyn had never heard before. Static hissed briefly. Then Evelyn Marrow continued. "I don't know who will find this first. Evelyn, if it's you," the tape paused, a shaky inhale. "I'm sorry." Evelyn looked down immediately. Her eyes burned. Lucas remained silent beside her. The tape continued. Blackwood Manor was built over something older than the village itself, older than the church, older than the tunnels beneath the cliffs. Static crackled sharply. "When your father began excavating beneath the greenhouse, he thought he discovered smuggling chambers." Evelyn frowned. "My father?" Margaret nodded faintly. "He worked restoration projects around the estate." Evelyn barely remembered him. Only fragments, a deep laugh. "Hands stained with dirt, then nothing, because he disappeared when she was 7 years old." The tape continued. "But he found something else." A long silence followed. Then Elena whispered, "A room." Thunder rolled across the church roof. Lucas leaned closer toward the recorder. The room was sealed beneath layers of stone. There were markings on the walls, symbols older than any language we recognized. Evelyn felt cold crawl beneath her skin. Your father believed it was part of an old religious settlement hidden beneath Blackwater centuries ago. The tape crackled again, then Alina's voice lowered further. But the room wasn't empty. Silence swallowed the church. Even the rain seemed quieter now. Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" No one answered. The tape hissed softly. Then another voice interrupted the recording. Male, distorted, angry. "Elena, stop this." Evelyn froze. She recognized the voice instantly. The man from the pier, 15 years younger. Her mother spoke again rapidly now. "If anything happens to me, you must never let them reopen the chamber beneath the greenhouse." A loud crash interrupted the recording. Shouting erupted in the background. Then Alina screamed, not fear, warning. "Run, Evelyn!" The tape cut abruptly into static, then silence. No one in the church moved. Evelyn stared at the dead recorder in horror. Lucas looked pale now. Margaret closed her eyes. She tried to stop them. Evelyn's voice barely worked. "My father disappeared because of that room?" Margaret nodded once. "Yes, and my mother knew." She knew too much. Thunder shook the stained glass windows violently overhead. Then the church bells began ringing. Loud, sudden, violent, all by themselves. Lucas stood instantly. "That's not wind." The bells continued ringing furiously through the storm. Then came another sound. The church doors downstairs opening slowly. Footsteps entered the chapel below, heavy, measured. A man's voice echoed upward through the church. "Evelyn," the same calm voice from the pier, "closer now. We need to talk." The bell tower confession, the church bells continued their violent ringing overhead, not rhythmic, not ceremonial, chaotic, like someone pulling the ropes with desperate force. Lucas extinguished the cassette player immediately. The chapel dropped into near darkness except for candlelight trembling near the altar. Footsteps echoed below them. Slow. Unhurried, the man wasn't chasing anymore, he was arriving. Margaret pushed herself upright despite the pain in her arm. He came himself. Lucas looked toward the staircase descending into the main sanctuary. "That bad?" Margaret met his eyes. "Yes." The footsteps stopped below. Then the man's voice drifted upward again, calm as rain. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Evelyn's chest tightened. There was something deeply unsettling about how reasonable he sounded. Not frantic. Not violent, controlled, like someone used to being obeyed. Lucas moved closer to the balcony rail carefully and looked down into the church below. Evelyn followed. The man stood alone near the front pews beneath the stained glass windows. Tall, gray harbor coat still damp from the storm. Silver hair combed neatly despite the rain. One hand resting lightly atop a cane. And beside him, another figure stood silently in the shadows. The pale figure from the tunnels, still impossible to see clearly. Only the white hands remained visible beneath the long dark sleeves. The man looked upward directly at Evelyn and smiled faintly. "There you are." Something about the familiarity in his expression chilled her instantly, as though he'd known her much longer than she realized. Lucas stepped into view deliberately. "Leave." The older man sighed softly. "You always were emotional, Lucas. You always were a liar." That earned a brief smile. "Fair." Evelyn gripped the balcony rail harder. "Who are you?" The man looked up at her fully now, and for the first time something almost human crossed his face. Sadness, My name is Arthur Vale. Margaret went rigid beside them. Evelyn looked sharply toward her. Vale, Margaret whispered bitterly, my brother. Silence settled heavily across the chapel. Arthur's eyes moved toward Margaret. You look terrible. You shot me. I told them not to. Lucas muttered under his breath. That's comforting. Arthur ignored him. Then slowly returned his attention to Evelyn. Your mother trusted me once. A deep ache twisted unexpectedly inside Evelyn's chest. Then why is she dead? Arthur's expression darkened slightly. She refused to let the past remain buried. The room beneath the greenhouse, Evelyn said carefully. At those words, even the pale figure beside Arthur seemed to react slightly, almost imperceptibly. Arthur removed his gloves slowly. His hands trembled faintly with age. Our father found something beneath Blackwood that should never have been disturbed. Lucas folded his arms. And yet you disturbed it anyway. Arthur's jaw tightened. We were trying to protect the village. Margaret laughed bitterly. You buried people alive. Arthur looked toward her sharply. We contained it. That's what you call it. Evelyn's pulse quickened painfully. Contained what? No one answered immediately. Thunder rolled over the church roof. Rain streaked down the stained glass windows like tears. Arthur finally spoke quietly. Blackwood Manor was built over an old settlement abandoned centuries ago after a sickness spread through the coast. Sickness? Lucas repeated. Arthur nodded slowly. The records called it the Hollowing. The name itself felt wrong somehow. Cold, ancient. Arthur continued. People stopped sleeping. They heard voices underground. Entire families vanished from their homes overnight. Margaret shook her head. Tell her the truth. Arthur ignored her. The survivors sealed the tunnels beneath the cliffs and built the church above them. Evelyn's skin prickled. And the room? Arthur's expression tightened. Your father opened it. Silence. Then Evelyn whispered, What was inside? Arthur looked toward the pale figure beside him. For a long moment neither moved. Then finally he answered, A child. The church seemed to grow colder instantly. Lucas frowned. What kind of child? Arthur didn't answer right away. Instead he said something far worse. It was still alive. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the bells overhead had finally fallen silent. Evelyn stared at Arthur, trying to understand what she'd just heard. That's impossible. Arthur nodded once. Yes, Margaret whispered bitterly. That's exactly what your mother said. The pale figure beside Arthur shifted slightly in the shadows. Evelyn strained to see the face beneath the hood. Still nothing clear, only pale skin, motionless hands. Lucas's voice hardened. You expect us to believe there's some immortal child living under Blackwood Manor? Arthur looked exhausted suddenly. Believe whatever helps you sleep. Margaret stepped forward despite Lucas trying to stop her. It wasn't a child anymore. Arthur's eyes flashed sharply toward her. Enough! No. Margaret's voice trembled with anger now. She deserves the truth. Arthur gripped his cane tighter. The truth destroyed her mother. Evelyn felt dizzy. Every answer only opened something worse underneath it. My mother knew this thing existed. Margaret nodded slowly. She heard it first. The church air suddenly felt thin. What do you mean? Margaret looked toward the stained glass windows as rain moved endlessly beyond them. Your mother started hearing crying beneath the manor after your father disappeared. Evelyn remembered that. Late nights. Her mother wandering hallways carrying candles, listening at walls, whispering to empty rooms. Lucas glanced toward Evelyn carefully. She told me the house made her sick. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, because that part was true. Some nights the manor felt almost alive, watching, listening. Arthur's voice softened unexpectedly. Elena believed the thing beneath the greenhouse was trapped. Margaret looked at him sharply. It was. Arthur's face darkened. No, he said quietly. It was waiting. Thunder cracked violently overhead. The church lights flickered, and suddenly the pale figure beside Arthur lifted its head. Directly toward the balcony, toward Evelyn. For the first time she saw its face clearly, and every drop of warmth vanished from her body, not because it looked monstrous, because it looked familiar, too familiar. The figure was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, pale skin, dark wet hair, thin features, and eyes identical to Evelyn. Evelyn stepped backward instantly. Lucas caught her arm. "What is it?" She could barely speak. The young woman stared upward silently. Expressionless, Arthur looked tired now. "You see it too." Evelyn's pulse rawed painfully. "Who is she?" No one answered immediately. Then Margaret whispered, "She shouldn't exist." The young woman finally spoke, her voice soft as dust. "Evelyn!" The sound of her own name from those lips nearly stopped Evelyn's heart. Lucas stepped protectively in front of her. Arthur closed his eyes briefly like a man surrendering to something inevitable. The young woman tilted her head slightly, then smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, sadly, and Evelyn realized with horrifying certainty she had seen that face before, not in town, not in photographs, in dreams, for years, long before the letter arrived. The church lights suddenly went out completely. Darkness swallowed the chapel. Margaret whispered sharply, "No," then came the sound. Soft footsteps above them. Inside the bell tower, something moving overhead. Arthur's voice changed instantly, fear breaking through calm for the first time. "Get away from the tower." Too late. A scream exploded from above. Not human, not entirely. The bell overhead began swinging violently again. The ropes snapped downward through the darkness. Wood cracked somewhere high above, and then something heavy began descending the spiral staircase from the tower. Fast. The thing in the bell tower, the staircase above them, shook violently. Heavy impacts slammed against the old wooden steps as something descended through the darkness far too quickly to be human. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's wrist instantly. "Move." But nobody moved fast enough. A priest's body came crashing over the upper railing first. It hit the chapel floor below with a sickening crack before sliding across the aisle beneath the stained glass windows. Dead, eyes wide open, neck twisted unnaturally. Margaret gasped sharply. "Father Ben," the bells continued ringing overhead. Violent now, wild. Arthur looked upward with genuine horror spreading across his face. "It got loose." Lucas pulled Evelyn backward toward the rear hallway. "What the hell is that thing?" Arthur didn't answer, because at that exact moment, something appeared at the top of the balcony stairs. Tall, bent unnaturally beneath the low ceiling, moving in jerking motions through the darkness. Evelyn only saw fragments at first, long pale fingers gripping the railing, wet black hair hanging across a face too thin to look healthy, bare feet. Then it lifted its head, and Evelyn's stomach turned violently. The creature looked almost human. Almost. But the eyes were wrong, too wide, too black, and the smile stretching slowly across its face looked practiced rather than natural, like something imitating human expression without understanding it. Margaret whispered hoarsely, "Don't let it speak." The thing tilted its head sharply toward her, then it laughed softly. A child's laugh, broken somehow. Lucas shoved Evelyn toward the side hallway. Go! The creature moved instantly. Not running, not walking. It lunged across the balcony ceiling with horrifying speed, fingers clawing against wood above them. Arthur shouted something below. The young pale woman beside him suddenly sprinted forward unnaturally fast, straight toward the staircase. She collided with the creature mid-descent. Both slammed violently into the railing. Wood exploded outward. The balcony cracked beneath them. Evelyn heard herself scream. Lucas dragged her through the side chapel doors just as the railing collapsed entirely behind them. The crash shook the entire church. The hallway beyond the chapel twisted through old stone corridors behind the sanctuary. Darkness swallowed everything except brief lightning flashes through narrow windows. Lucas moved fast, too fast for Evelyn to process what she'd just seen. What was that? No idea. That's not reassuring. Behind them came screaming, multiple voices, then another terrible sound, wet tearing. Lucas shoved open another door and pulled her into a storage chamber filled with candles and old religious statues. Margaret stumbled in moments later, clutching her wounded arm. Arthur followed. Alone, the pale young woman was gone. Arthur slammed the door shut. For the first time since meeting him, he looked shaken, truly shaken. Lucas grabbed him by the coat instantly. You explain right now. Arthur shoved him off hard. You think I understand it? You said it got loose. Arthur's breathing looked uneven now. It's never attacked inside the church before. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You still think it obeys rules? Evelyn backed against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled violently. The creature's face burned into her memory already. Not fully human, but not fully monstrous either. And somehow it had looked at her with recognition. Arthur noticed her expression. It spoke to you before, didn't it? Evelyn looked sharply toward him. What? In dreams? The room fell silent. Lucas stared between them. Evelyn swallowed painfully. How do you know that? Arthur looked exhausted. Because it spoke to your mother the same way. A loud impact slammed against the storage room door. Everyone froze. Another impact followed immediately. Harder. The old wood splintered slightly near the hinges. Lucas grabbed a heavy brass candle holder from the shelf. Margaret whispered, "It found us." The creature laughed softly from the other side of the door. Then came a voice, soft, almost affectionate. Evelyn, her blood ran cold instantly, not because of the voice itself, because it sounded exactly like her mother. Lucas stared at her. The creature repeated softly, "Please." Another violent slam hit the door. Wood cracked sharply. Arthur backed toward the far wall. "There's another passage," Margaret frowned. "You sealed it." "I know." The creature outside scratched slowly against the wood now. Patient. Listening, Arthur shoved aside an old bookshelf, revealing a narrow stone opening hidden behind it. Cold air drifted through. Lucas immediately motioned Evelyn toward it. She hesitated only once, because from outside the door came her mother's voice again, crying this time. "Evelyn, don't leave me here." Tears burned unexpectedly behind Evelyn's eyes. The sound felt real, too real. Lucas gripped her shoulders firmly. "That thing is not your mother." The door cracked violently inward behind them. Long pale fingers curled through the splintered opening. Arthur shouted, "Move!" They fled into the hidden passage just as the creature burst through the storage room door behind them. The tunnel beneath the church climbed sharply upward through cold stone. Arthur sealed the hidden entrance behind them with an iron lever embedded in the wall. A heavy stone barrier groaned shut somewhere below. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Only their breathing filled the narrow passage. Then Lucas turned on Arthur furiously. "You kept that thing alive?" Arthur looked 30 years older suddenly. "We tried to study it." Margaret laughed bitterly through exhaustion. "There it is." Arthur ignored her. "When your father found the chamber, we believed we'd uncovered a survivor." Evelyn stared at him. "A survivor from centuries ago?" "Yes." "That's insane." Arthur nodded once. "Yes." The honesty of that answer unsettled her deeply. Lightning flashed faintly through cracks overhead as the tunnel continued upward. The storm still raged outside. Arthur continued quietly. "It looked human when we first found it." Lucas frowned. "What changed?" Arthur looked at Evelyn. "Isolation." Margaret shook her head sharply. "No, the tunnels changed it." Arthur's expression hardened. "The tunnels didn't do anything." "Then why does everyone who hears it start seeing things?" Silence. Evelyn's pulse quickened again. Seeing things, dreams, voices. Her mother wandering Blackwood Manor at night, whispering to empty walls. The crying sounds inside the house. Arthur finally said quietly, "It learns people." The tunnel seemed colder suddenly. Lucas folded his arms tightly. "What does that mean?" Arthur's voice lowered further. "It copies grief." Nobody spoke after that, because deep down every one of them already understood. The voices, the dreams, her mother calling through the door, not random. The creature used memories, pain, loneliness. Evelyn suddenly remembered the photographs underground, months of someone watching her, studying her, learning her. A horrible thought surfaced. The woman in the church. Arthur looked at her carefully. She was the first. "The first what?" Margaret answered instead. "The first child born after the chamber was opened." Cold spread through Evelyn's chest. "She looked like me." Margaret's eyes filled with something close to pity. "Yes." Lucas stared sharply between them. "What aren't you saying?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Arthur whispered the words Evelyn somehow already feared. "Your mother was pregnant before the fire." The tunnel vanished around Evelyn for one terrifying second. "What?" Arthur looked directly at her. "She was carrying twins. The child who was never buried, no." The word escaped Evelyn instantly. Sharp, breathless, impossible. The tunnel seemed to tilt around her as rain thundered faintly overhead through layers of stone. Arthur held her gaze carefully, not cruel, not manipulative, simply resigned. Lucas stepped forward immediately. "That's not possible." Margaret looked away first, which told Evelyn everything. Her chest tightened painfully. "My mother never had another child." "She did," Arthur said quietly. Evelyn shook her head harder now. No, she would have told me." Arthur's expression darkened. "Your mother spent the last years of her life trying to protect you from what happened beneath Blackwood." Lucas looked toward Evelyn carefully. "She could have hidden it." Evelyn rounded on him instantly. "You believe this?" "I believe people are dead, Evelyn." Silence slammed into the tunnel again. The creature's distant screams echoed faintly somewhere far below beneath the church. Not human, never human. Evelyn pressed both hands against the cold stone wall, trying to steady herself. Twins, another child, a sister. Memories surfaced violently now. Fragments she had buried for years. A tiny hand gripping hers in darkness. A lullaby her mother only sang at night. A second heartbeat during storms. Then blood. Smoke. Fire. Evelyn's breathing quickened. Margaret stepped closer. You were very young. I would remember a sister. Margaret's face tightened painfully. You do. That answer hit harder than shouting ever could. Arthur spoke carefully now. After the chamber was opened, strange things started happening in the manor. Lucas muttered bitterly. Understatement. Arthur ignored him. Your mother became convinced something beneath the house was attached to the pregnancy. Evelyn looked sick. What does that even mean? No one fully understood. You experimented anyway. Arthur flinched slightly at that. Margaret answered instead. They thought the chamber could preserve life. The tunnel suddenly felt freezing cold. Lucas frowned deeply. Preserve? Arthur rubbed one hand over his face slowly. The body we found below Blackwood should have been impossible. What body? Evelyn whispered. Arthur hesitated, then finally said, the child beneath the chamber. Silence. Lucas stared at him. You said it was alive. It was. How? Arthur laughed softly. Broken. If I knew that, none of this would exist. Evelyn felt nausea twisting inside her stomach. What happened to my sister? Nobody answered immediately, and that silence terrified her more than anything else tonight. Finally, Margaret whispered, the fire happened before anyone could stop it. The memory returned instantly now, not fully, just flashes, her mother screaming, smoke swallowing the greenhouse windows, a child crying somewhere beneath the floor. Evelyn staggered slightly. Lucas caught her arm before she fell. She's remembering. Arthur looked almost frightened by that. Evelyn, but she barely heard him now. The tunnel walls blurred. Another memory surfaced. A little girl standing outside the greenhouse during the storm, dark hair soaked from rain, watching the flames calmly, not trapped inside, outside, waiting. Evelyn whispered, she survived. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Yes. The air vanished from Evelyn's lungs. No, Margaret stepped closer carefully. We buried the remains we found after the fire. You buried the wrong child, Evelyn whispered. No one denied it. Thunder cracked overhead violently, and somewhere below them, the creature screamed again. Long, agonized, almost grieving. The tunnel eventually emerged inside an abandoned lighthouse above the cliffs west of Blackwater. Wind slammed against the old stone tower hard enough to shake the windows. Lucas bolted the entrance behind them while Margaret collapsed into an old wooden chair near the rusted lantern machinery. The lighthouse smelled like salt water and old oil. Cold, lonely. Evelyn stood near the cracked windows staring toward Blackwood Manor in the distance. The estate loomed against the storm like a black wound above the cliffs, her home, her prison, her mother's grave, and now somehow connected to a sister she never knew existed. Lucas approached quietly behind her. You okay? The question felt absurd, but his voice remained gentle, careful, like 15 years ago before everything broke apart between them. Evelyn laughed once softly, not because anything was funny. I don't know what's real anymore. Lucas leaned beside the window. Rain streaked across the glass between them and the sea. Real enough for people to die. She looked at him finally. You think that creature is my sister? Lucas hesitated, then answered honestly. I think something terrible happened to your family. Not an answer, but maybe the only truthful one left. Arthur moved slowly through the lighthouse behind them, lighting old oil lamps one by one. His face looked gray with exhaustion now, older than before. Margaret watched him silently from across the room. Decades of hatred lived between them, and guilt, so much guilt. Evelyn turned toward Arthur sharply. Tell me exactly what happened the night of the fire. Arthur froze beside the lantern. For a moment, the storm outside filled the silence. Then he nodded once. Your mother called me to the manor after midnight. His voice sounded distant now, like someone reciting a nightmare too many times. She believed something beneath the greenhouse had taken your sister. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. What does that mean? Arthur stared into the lantern flame. Your sister disappeared from her bedroom. The room went completely still. Lucas frowned. She was kidnapped. No. Arthur swallowed slowly. There were no footprints, no broken windows, nothing. Margaret whispered bitterly. The nursery door was locked from the inside. Evelyn felt her skin crawl. Arthur continued. Your mother heard crying beneath the greenhouse. She became convinced the chamber had called to the child somehow. That's insane. Yes, but you believed her. Arthur looked toward Blackwood Manor through the lighthouse glass. Because when we opened the chamber, he paused. We found toys inside. A deep chill moved through the room. Children's toys, Margaret whispered. Centuries old. Evelyn's heartbeat hammered painfully. Arthur continued softly. Your mother went below the greenhouse alone before we arrived. What did she find? Arthur looked directly at her. She came back carrying a child. Silence. Evelyn could barely breathe now. She found my sister. Arthur nodded slowly. But your mother said something was wrong. Lucas crossed his arms tightly. What kind of wrong? Arthur's voice lowered almost to a whisper. She said the child wouldn't blink. Rain battered the lighthouse windows violently. No one spoke, because suddenly every strange thing felt horribly connected. The dreams, the voices, the mimicry, the creature using Alina's voice in the church, learning grief, copying people. Evelyn whispered. What happened after that? Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Your mother tried to burn the chamber. Another memory exploded through Evelyn's mind. Her mother dragging her through smoke-filled hallways, screaming at someone downstairs, and another child standing motionless inside the greenhouse doorway while flames spread behind her. Watching, always watching. Tears burned behind Evelyn's eyes now. She knew it wasn't her. Arthur said nothing, which answered everything. Margaret suddenly stiffened in her chair. Lucas noticed immediately. What is it? Margaret looked toward the lighthouse stairs leading downward. Fear hollowed her face instantly. Did anyone lock the lower entrance? Arthur's expression changed sharply. Yes, Margaret whispered. Then who opened it? Everyone froze. A slow creaking sound echoed upward from below, the lighthouse door opening. Then footsteps began climbing the spiral staircase beneath them, slow, wet, bare feet against stone, one step at a time, and softly, almost lovingly, a young woman's voice drifted upward through the lighthouse. Evelyn! The nursery beneath the greenhouse, the footsteps continued climbing. Slow. Deliberate, bare skin against wet stone. Evelyn stood frozen near the lighthouse window while the voice drifted upward again through the spiral staircase. Evelyn, soft, gentle, like someone trying not to frighten her, which somehow made it worse. Lucas grabbed the iron fireplace poker leaning beside the wall. Arthur extinguished 2 lanterns immediately, darkening the room. Margaret whispered sharply. It followed us. No, Arthur muttered. It tracked her. Evelyn felt every eye turn toward her. The realization hit like ice water. The creature wasn't hunting randomly, it wanted her. The footsteps stopped halfway up the staircase below. Silence settled over the lighthouse. Then the young woman spoke again. You remember me now? Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. No, not remembering exactly, but feeling fragments. A little girl standing beside her bed during storms. A hand pressed against nursery gloss. A voice whispering beneath floorboards late at night. Lucas stepped protectively in front of Evelyn. What happens if it reaches her? Arthur answered too quickly. I don't know. Margaret laughed bitterly. That means yes. Arthur glared at her. You think fear helps? No, Margaret whispered. Truth does. The voice below became quieter, closer somehow despite no footsteps. I waited for you. Evelyn's pulse thundered painfully. The thing sounded lonely. Not angry, lonely. That frightened her more than rage ever could. Lucas whispered without taking his eyes off the staircase. We leave through the roof. Arthur nodded immediately. There's a maintenance ladder outside. Margaret stood shakily despite the wound. She'll never outrun it. Evelyn looked sharply toward her. Margaret's eyes filled with exhausted sorrow. It still thinks it's your sister. Silence. Then the staircase groaned softly below. Another step upward. Lucas moved first. He grabbed Evelyn's hand and pulled her toward the upper hatch leading onto the lighthouse roof. Wind screamed violently outside as he forced the hatch open. Rain exploded inward instantly. The storm had worsened again. Blackwater Bay vanished beneath fog and crashing waves far below the cliffs. Arthur helped Margaret onto the roof while Lucas climbed off to Evelyn. The metal ladder attached to the lighthouse exterior rattled dangerously in the wind. We descend one at a time, Lucas shouted over the storm. A loud crash echoed from inside below them, the lighthouse door splintering. Arthur looked pale instantly. It's inside. Another crash followed, faster now, moving upward through the tower. Lucas motioned urgently toward the ladder. Go! Margaret descended first painfully. Arthur followed. Lucas turned toward Evelyn, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring through the open hatch into the darkness below. Something was standing there. Watching from inside the lighthouse. The young woman, rainwater dripped from her dark hair, her pale face tilted upward silently. And now, fully illuminated by lightning, Evelyn saw the resemblance perfectly. Not identical, but close enough to hurt, like seeing herself reflected through water. The young woman smiled softly. You left me there. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's arm hard. Don't listen to it. But Evelyn barely heard him, because suddenly another memory surfaced. Not a dream. A real memory. A little girl crying beneath the greenhouse floor. Evelyn standing at the top of the stairs, too frightened to go lower, and her mother shouting, Take Evelyn outside. The memory vanished instantly, but one truth remained. There really had been another child. The young woman stepped closer beneath the hatch. I was cold. Lucas shoved the hatch downward violently. The metal slammed shut between them. Then he dragged Evelyn toward the ladder. Move! The descent nearly killed them. Wind battered the lighthouse cliffs hard enough to shake the ladder bolts loose from stone. Below them, the sea crashed violently against black rocks. Margaret slipped twice before Lucas caught her from above. Arthur descended quickly despite his age, constantly glancing upward toward the hatch. Something hammered against it from inside. Again. Metal bent sharply outward. Evelyn climbed lost. Rain blinded her completely. Halfway down the ladder, she heard the hatch finally rip open overhead. A scream tore through the storm, not rage, agony. The sound echoed across the cliffs like something grieving. Lucas looked upward sharply. The young woman crouched at the lighthouse edge above them, watching. Wind whipped her dark hair violently around her face. Lightning illuminated her eyes, black, empty, and heartbreakingly human at the same time. Then she leapt, not toward them, past them, straight down the cliffside. Evelyn screamed instinctively. But the figure vanished into darkness before hitting the rocks below. Impossible. No human could survive that fall. Lucas reached the ground first and pulled Evelyn off the ladder. "We need to go now." Arthur stared toward the cliffs where the figure disappeared. "It's learning faster," Margaret whispered. "No, it's remembering." That silence again, heavy, terrible. The storm swallowed the lighthouse behind them as they hurried across the cliff path toward the village cemetery. Evelyn finally spoke through shaking breath. "She said I left her there." Arthur looked grim. "You did." Lucas turned sharply. "She was a child." Arthur's voice lowered. "So was Evelyn." They reached the cemetery just before dawn. Fog drifted low between crooked gravestones while rain softened into cold mist around the church hill. The village below remained dark and silent. Too silent. No harbor traffic, no bakery smoke, no lights. Blackwater felt abandoned. Margaret noticed it too. "They already know." Lucas scanned the empty roads carefully. "Know what?" Arthur answered quietly. "That it's awake." Evelyn wrapped her soaked coat tighter around herself. Every bone in her body ached from exhaustion, but the deeper pain came from memory. The missing years slowly returning. A nursery upstairs at Blackwood Manor. 2 cribs, not one. Her mother crying alone at night. And beneath all of it, the terrible certainty that someone had erased part of her life intentionally. Margaret stopped suddenly beside an old family mausoleum near the cemetery edge. Stone angels stood blackened with age above rusted gates. Arthur looked immediately uneasy. "No," Margaret ignored him. Instead, she pulled a ring of old keys from her coat. Lucas frowned. "What is this place?" Margaret unlocked the iron gate slowly. "The Marrow crypt." Evelyn stared. "My family has a crypt." Arthur rubbed tiredly at his face. "You were never supposed to see this." Margaret pushed the gate open. Cold, damp air drifted outward from the darkness below. Stone stairs descended underground. Of course they did. Everything in Blackwater led underground eventually. Margaret looked toward Evelyn carefully. "If you want the truth," she nodded toward the stairs. "It's buried here." Arthur grabbed Margaret's arm sharply. "She's not ready." Margaret pulled free. "She deserves to know what they buried beside her mother." Evelyn felt ice spread through her veins. "What's buried down there?" Margaret's eyes met hers. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Evelyn saw tears there. "A coffin," Margaret whispered, "too small to belong to an adult." The grave with 2 names the crypt smelled like wet stone and old dust. Cold air curled upward from the darkness below as Margaret lit a small lantern near the stairwell entrance. Lucas descended first, one cautious step at a time. Evelyn followed slowly behind him, every instinct screaming at her to turn back before she saw whatever waited underground. But it was too late for turning back now. Blackwood had already opened itself again, and every answer only led deeper into it. Arthur remained near the entrance above for several seconds before finally following them down, reluctantly, as though even he feared what remained hidden here. The stone staircase ended inside a narrow burial chamber beneath the cemetery hill. Small, ancient. Rows of family tombs lined the walls beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. The lantern light flickered across engraved names. Marrows, Vale, Bennett, families intertwined for generations. Evelyn's footsteps echoed softly through the crypt until Margaret stopped before a sealed stone vault near the far wall. The inscription above it made Evelyn's breath catch. Evelyn Marrow 1961–1991, below her mother's name, another line had been carved. Smaller, almost hidden. And child Evelyn stared numbly. No, Lucas looked toward Arthur sharply. You buried a child here? Arthur's face looked gray in the lantern light. There was a body after the fire. Margaret whispered bitterly, there were bones. Evelyn turned toward them slowly. You weren't sure. No answer, and that silence said everything. Her chest tightened painfully. They buried someone without even knowing who it was. Arthur rubbed trembling fingers against his forehead. The fire destroyed most of the greenhouse. We found remains beneath the collapsed floor. But not enough to identify, Margaret snapped. We did what we could. No, Margaret whispered. You did what protected the village. The crypt suddenly felt suffocating. Evelyn stepped toward the grave slowly, her mother and child, not even a name, just absence. Lucas noticed her shaking hands. Evelyn, but she barely heard him, because another memory surfaced. Her mother kneeling beside two beds upstairs during a thunderstorm. One little girl asleep. The other staring wide awake into darkness, watching the walls. The memory vanished before Evelyn could fully grasp it, but this time she heard a name. Clara, her knees nearly buckled. Lucas caught her instantly. What happened? Evelyn looked at him in shock. She had a name. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Arthur stared sharply. You remember? Clara, Evelyn whispered. The lantern flame flickered violently, and somewhere inside the crypt a child laughed softly. Everyone froze. Lucas lifted the lantern quickly. Who's there? Silence answered. Then another sound, tiny footsteps running across stone deeper within the crypt. Fast, barefoot. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Arthur whispered immediately, she followed us. Margaret backed away from the grave. No, not here. Lucas grabbed the lantern and moved toward the sound. The crypt extended farther than Evelyn first realized. Old burial corridors disappeared deeper beneath the cemetery. More tunnels, always tunnels. The footsteps echoed again, then stopped abruptly. Lucas lifted the lantern higher. The light revealed another chamber ahead. Smaller, older, and at its center stood a child-sized wooden chair facing the wall. Evelyn stopped breathing. The wall was covered in drawings, hundreds of them. Charcoal sketches layered over stone, faces, houses, trees, the greenhouse, and over again 2 little girls holding hands, one labeled Evelyn, the other Clara. Evelyn's knees weakened. Oh God. Margaret looked horrified. She's been down here. Arthur stared at the drawings in disbelief. That's impossible. Lucas crouched beside one sketch near the floor. Fresh charcoal dust smeared across the stone. Recent, very recent. The child's chair creaked softly. Everyone turned sharply. The chair was moving, slowly rocking by itself, back, forth. Then a soft voice echoed through the chamber, not from one direction, from everywhere. You forgot me. Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. Clara. Lucas grabbed her arm immediately. Don't. But Evelyn stepped forward anyway, toward the chair, toward the drawings, toward the grief buried beneath 20 years of lies. The voice softened. You left me alone. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Evelyn's eyes. I didn't know. Silence. Then the chair stopped rocking. A small handprint slowly appeared against the dusty wall beside the drawings. Fresh, wet, child-sized, Margaret whispered a prayer under her breath. Arthur looked genuinely frightened now. "She's never done this before." Lucas stared sharply at him. "You keep saying that." Because whatever this thing was, it was changing, learning, evolving, and somehow Evelyn's return had accelerated everything. The lantern flickered suddenly, then died. Darkness swallowed the crypt completely. Evelyn heard breathing nearby, not Lucas, not Margaret, something else, close enough to feel. Then a child whispered beside her ear, "Do you remember the nursery?" Evelyn gasped sharply. And suddenly the memory hit in full, rain against windows. A storm over Blackwater, two little girls hiding beneath blankets upstairs. One was Evelyn, the other Clara, same dark hair, same gray eyes, twins. Clara whispered during thunder, "Something S under the house." Evelyn laughed nervously, then came scratching beneath the nursery floor. Slow, patient. Clara climbed from bed, walked toward the floorboards, listening, then smiled strangely. "It wants to play." The memory shattered violently. Evelyn stumbled backward into someone's chest. Lucas caught her instantly. The lantern reignited with a sputtering flash. Arthur looked pale. "What did you see?" Evelyn could barely speak. "She talked to it." Margaret closed her eyes. "Yes," Arthur whispered. "No," Evelyn turned sharply toward him. "You knew." Arthur looked devastated. "We thought it was mimicking her." "But it was." Silence answered. Lucas frowned deeply. "What does that mean?" Evelyn stared toward the child's drawings covering the crypt wall and suddenly understood something terrible. Clara had heard the thing beneath the greenhouse long before the adults found the chamber, before the fire, before the disappearances, maybe even before her father vanished. The voice returned softly through the crypt. Lonely, broken. "I was never alone down there." The lanterns shattered all at once. Glass exploded across the stone floor. Darkness crashed over them again. Then came the sound, small feet running rapidly through the crypt corridors around them. Circling, laughing, and somewhere deep beneath the cemetery, another voice answered. Older, male, hungry. The voice beneath Blackwater, the second voice echoed through the crypt like something waking from sleep. Low, wet, ancient. Not loud, yet somehow it vibrated through the stone beneath their feet. Evelyn felt it inside her chest more than heard it. The child's laughter stopped instantly. Silence swallowed the darkness. Then Clara whispered somewhere nearby, "He's awake." Lucas grabbed Evelyn's hand hard enough to hurt. "We're leaving?" Arthur's breathing sounded uneven now. "That voice," Margaret whispered sharply. "We sealed that chamber." The older voice came again, far below them this time, a sound like words trying to remember how to become language. The crypt walls trembled faintly. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Lucas relit one surviving lantern with shaking hands. The weak glow revealed something new across the chamber floor, fresh cracks, running between the grave toward the deeper tunnels beneath the cemetery. Arthur saw them too. His face lost all remaining color. "No," Margaret stared at the fractures. "It's spreading." Evelyn looked sharply between them. "What's spreading?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he whispered something almost to himself. "The seals are breaking." Lucas snapped. "Enough with the riddles." Arthur looked exhausted beyond fear now. The chamber beneath Blackwood wasn't the only one. Cold silence settled over the crypt. Evelyn's pulse quickened painfully. "What does that mean?" Arthur lifted the lantern toward the tunnels disappearing deeper underground. There's an entire network beneath the village. Margaret nodded grimly. The old settlement. Arthur continued quietly. When the sickness spread centuries ago, the villagers buried everything beneath the cliffs. What sickness? Lucas asked. Arthur looked toward Evelyn. The voices. That word again. Voices, not disease, not plague, something else. Evelyn remembered her mother whispering alone in hallways, remembered Clara listening beneath the nursery floor, remembered hearing crying inside the manor walls herself as a child. The older voice echoed again. Closer now. The lantern flickered violently, and suddenly every grave in the crypt began creaking softly, wood shifting beneath stone. Margaret backed away immediately. No, no, no. Lucas stepped protectively in front of Evelyn. What's happening? Arthur whispered. It's calling them. The crypt temperature dropped sharply. Cold breath curled visibly through the lantern light now. Then came the scratching from inside the walls. Hundreds of tiny scratches moving beneath the stone around them. Evelyn's skin crawled violently. Clara's voice drifted through the dark again. Soft, urgent now. You need to leave. Lucas turned sharply toward the sound. Where are you? No answer. Then suddenly, a child appeared at the far end of the crypt corridor. Not the pale young woman from before, a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, soaked dark hair hanging around her face. Gray eyes fixed on Evelyn, Clara exactly as she'd appeared in Evelyn's memories. Evelyn stopped breathing. The child looked frightened, truly frightened, not monstrous, not manipulative, just afraid. Clara, Lucas grabbed Evelyn immediately. Don't go near her. But the child shook her head quickly. He's coming. The deeper voice beneath the crypt groaned again. Closer, the stone floor cracked louder this time. Dust exploded upward from between the grave. Arthur looked terrified now. We have to seal this place. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. With what? Arthur looked toward Evelyn, and for the first time since meeting him, genuine guilt broke through his composure completely. Your mother knew how. Evelyn's throat tightened. What did she do? Arthur swallowed slowly. She used blood. Silence. Lucas stared at him. What? The chamber responded to bloodlines, Arthur whispered. Margaret looked sick. Don't tell her that. It's already too late. The child at the corridor's end stepped backward slowly. Please hurry. Then vanished into darkness. Immediately afterward, something massive slammed against the stone wall beneath the crypt. The impact nearly knocked everyone off balance. Grave cracked open around them. The older voice rose again, no longer distant, directly below them now. And this time, Evelyn understood a word. Home. They fled the crypt moments before the floor collapsed. Stone exploded upward behind them as they raced toward the staircase. Lucas shoved Evelyn ahead while Arthur struggled to support Margaret through the crumbling corridor. Another violent impact shook the underground chamber, then another. The grave split apart one by one behind them. Dust swallowed everything. Evelyn heard the older voice laughing now, not human laughter, something deeper. Like rocks grinding underwater, they burst from the crypt into the cemetery just as the underground chamber collapsed entirely beneath the hill. Stone caved inward with a deafening roar. Ancient grave vanished into darkness. The ground trembled beneath Blackwater, and all across the village, church bells began ringing again, by themselves. The fog surrounding the cemetery thickened instantly. Lucas pulled Evelyn away from the collapsing earth. Arthur stared in horror at the crater where the crypt once stood. It's open. Margaret coughed violently beside him. You knew this would happen eventually. Arthur looked shattered. I thought we had more time. Lightning flashed over Blackwater Bay. For one terrible second, the entire village illuminated below them, and Evelyn saw figures standing motionless in the streets, dozens of them, villagers, watching the church hill silently through the storm. Lucas saw them too. What the hell? None of the figures moved. They simply stood there beneath the rain, facing the cemetery. Facing Evelyn, Margaret whispered, "They can hear it now." Another deep groan rose from beneath the earth. The villagers below slowly began walking uphill. Together, Arthur stepped backward. No, Evelyn looked sharply at him. What's wrong with them? Arthur answered quietly. The same thing that happened before. The fog moved strangely around the village streets now, not drifting naturally, pulling inward, toward Blackwood Manor, toward the cliffs, like the entire town was breathing. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's shoulders firmly. We need to leave Blackwater. Arthur looked at him sharply. You can't. Watch me. If she leaves now, it follows her. Silence. Evelyn felt sick. What? Arthur pointed toward the village below. It's attached to her. Margaret whispered bitterly, just like Alina. Lucas shook his head immediately. No. Arthur's eyes moved toward Evelyn. It wants the bloodline restored. The words felt insane, yet nothing tonight had obeyed sanity. Another scream echoed from somewhere in town below, then another, panic spreading through the streets. The villagers climbing uphill began moving faster now, not walking anymore, running. Lucas cursed sharply. We move. Arthur pointed toward Blackwood Manor looming above the cliffs. There's only one place left. Evelyn stared at the estate through the storm. No. Arthur met her eyes directly. The greenhouse chamber. Cold flooded through her body. Margaret looked horrified. You'd bring her there. Arthur's voice broke slightly. It started there. Lightning split the sky overhead violently, and far below the cemetery hill, something enormous moved beneath the streets of Blackwater. The greenhouse ruins, they crushed Blackwater in darkness while the town unraveled around them. The fog thickened unnaturally through the streets, swallowing entire buildings whole before spitting them back out seconds later. Church bells rang non-stop. Windows glowed in houses where no lights should have existed, and everywhere voices. Whispers drifting through alleyways and behind doors, calling names softly. Lucas kept Evelyn close beside him as they moved uphill through the storm. Arthur led the way with a lantern shaking faintly in his hand. Margaret lagged behind from blood loss and exhaustion, but she refused to stop. No one spoke much, because every time silence settled, the town whispered. Evelyn heard it clearly now, not words exactly, fragments, memories, her mother humming somewhere nearby, Clara laughing inside the fog, her father calling from underground tunnels. Blackwater itself seemed alive with voices tonight. The deeper thing beneath the village was waking fully, and it was reaching through everyone's grief to do it. They passed the old cinema near the square. Its broken marquee suddenly flickered to life as they walked beneath it. Letters rearranged themselves slowly through buzzing neon. Welcome home. Lucas saw it too. Keep moving. The message vanished instantly afterward, but Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. Because part of her no longer knew whether the town wanted her dead or back. A scream echoed from somewhere near the harbor, then silence. Margaret whispered, "We're too late." Arthur didn't answer. Rain battered the streets harder now as they finally reached the cliffs above town. Blackwood Manor loomed ahead through fog and lightning like the silhouette of a shipwreck, but something had changed. Lights glowed inside, warm yellow lights behind windows that had stood dark for years. Evelyn stopped cold. No. Lucas stared at the house. "Who's in there?" Arthur looked horrified. It opened the manor. The front door slowly creaked inward by itself, waiting. Lightning illuminated the greenhouse ruins behind the estate, or rather what remained of them. Evelyn's breath caught painfully. The collapsed structure she vaguely remembered from childhood no longer looked destroyed. Parts of the glass roof stood repaired somehow. Fresh light glowed faintly beneath the broken frame. Someone had rebuilt it. Margaret whispered, "Oh God." Arthur looked genuinely shaken now. "It shouldn't be possible." Lucas turned sharply. "You keep saying that." Another voice drifted softly through the storm. "Clara S., come downstairs." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. The voice no longer sounded frightening. That terrified her more than anything. Inside Blackwood Manor, the air felt warm, too warm. Candles burned throughout the hallways. Fresh flowers sat in vases. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked again for the first time in 15 years. Someone had restored parts of the house carefully, lovingly. Evelyn walked through the entry hall in stunned silence. This wasn't abandonment anymore, it was preparation. The manor smelled faintly of lavender again. Lucas checked each room carefully while Arthur moved toward the back corridor leading to the greenhouse. Margaret lingered near the staircase, watching the upper floors nervously. Evelyn stopped beside the dining room doorway. The table had been set for dinner. 4 plates, 4 wine glasses. Fresh candles still burning low, as if someone expected guests. Lucas looked pale when he saw it. "We're being played with." Evelyn noticed something sitting in the center of the table, a framed photograph. She approached slowly, then froze. The picture showed her family. Not just Alina and Evelyn, all 4 of them, her father smiling beside her mother, 2 little girls sitting between them, Evelyn and Clara. The photograph looked recent, impossible. Her hands trembled violently. "Arthur." He looked at the picture, then went completely silent. Margaret stared at it too. That photograph burned in the fire. Lucas looked sharply between them. "Then who put it here?" Nobody answered, because somewhere upstairs footsteps began moving across the 3rd floor, slow, measured. A child running softly down the hallway. Evelyn's pulse quickened painfully. The locked room, still waiting above them. Arthur turned immediately toward the greenhouse corridor. "We don't have time." Lucas grabbed his arm. "You're finally going to explain exactly what's beneath this house." Arthur looked exhausted beyond words now. "The chamber was never empty." "You said that already." "No," Arthur swallowed hard. "I mean it was occupied long before we found it." Silence. Rain rattled against the manor windows. Margaret whispered, "The settlement beneath Blackwater worshipped something." Lucas laughed once bitterly. "Fantastic." Arthur ignored him. "The chamber held a family." Cold spread through Evelyn's body. "What kind of family?" Arthur looked directly at her. "We never found the parents." The hallway suddenly felt freezing cold. Lucas folded his arms tightly. "And the child?" Arthur's face hollowed. It had been sealed alive underground for centuries. No one spoke, because there was no sane response left. Only the storm outside, only the footsteps upstairs, only the unbearable sense that Blackwood Manor had been waiting all these years for someone to come back downstairs. Clara's voice drifted softly through the house again. "Please hurry." This time she sounded frightened, truly frightened. Then came another voice beneath hers, the deeper voice, the older voice, hungry. Arthur looked toward the greenhouse corridor instantly. It's waking fully. Lucas grabbed the fireplace poker tighter. And if it does, Arthur answered quietly, Blackwater disappears. The greenhouse stood behind the manor overlooking the cliffs. Rain hammered the broken glass roof while lantern light flickered faintly beneath the structure. Evelyn stepped inside slowly. The smell hit her instantly. Wet soil, ash, lavender, and beneath it something ancient. The greenhouse had been partially rebuilt around the burned remains of the original structure. New beams reinforced old charred wood. Candles lined the pathways between dead vines and shattered flower beds. Someone had been living here too, or preparing it. At the center of the greenhouse floor stood a large iron hatch embedded in stone. Fresh scratch marks covered its surface. Lucas stared at it grimly. That's the chamber, Arthur nodded slowly. Margaret looked terrified now. It shouldn't be open. Evelyn crouched beside the hatch carefully. Symbols had been carved around the edges. Strange twisting marks older than language, exactly like the ones her mother described on the tape. Then she noticed something else. Blood. Fresh blood smeared across the iron lock. Lucas saw it too. We're not first ones here tonight. The hatch suddenly groaned softly beneath them. Everyone froze. Another sound followed. Crying, a child crying beneath the floor. Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. Clara, Arthur stepped backward instinctively. No, the crying turned into coughing, then desperate banging against metal. Please, Clara screamed from below. Don't leave me here. Evelyn lunged toward the hatch instantly. Lucas caught her. Wait, but she's down there. Arthur grabbed Evelyn's arm hard. That's what it wants. She pulled free violently. She's my sister. Arthur's expression broke completely then. No, he whispered, and the way he said it made everyone go still. Rain hammered the greenhouse roof. The crying beneath the hatch suddenly stopped. Silence. Then slowly a different voice rose from below, deep, male, ancient, and unmistakably calm. Open the door. The chamber below Blackwood nobody moved. Rain battered the greenhouse roof in violent waves while the voice beneath the hatch echoed softly through the iron floor. Open the door. Not loud, not angry, patient, the way something ancient might speak after waiting a very long time. Lucas stepped between Evelyn and the hatch immediately. No, the voice below laughed quietly, a terrible sound. Wet, tired, almost human. Arthur looked pale enough to collapse. Margaret backed slowly toward the greenhouse entrance. It never spoke before. The iron hatch trembled faintly beneath them. Another knock echoed upward from below, 3 slow impacts. Like polite knocking at a front door, Evelyn's pulse hammered painfully, because buried beneath the horror another feeling had begun rising inside her. Recognition. The voice felt familiar somehow, not personally, emotionally, like hearing something from childhood you forgot you remembered. Lucas noticed her expression instantly. Don't listen to it. But Evelyn barely heard him. The hatch symbols seemed to move beneath the lantern light, twisting, breathing. She remembered tracing shapes like these in the nursery walls with Clara during storms. The realization hit hard. Clara had known these symbols as a child, long before anyone opened the chamber. Arthur whispered shakily, "It's inside her memory." Evelyn turned sharply. "What?" Arthur stared at the hatch. When the chamber opened, whatever was down there attached itself to Clara first. Margaret nodded slowly. She could hear it. Lucas looked disgusted. You people treated a child like an experiment. Arthur's face twisted painfully. No, but he sounded uncertain now, and that uncertainty terrified Evelyn more than any confession. Another soft knock came from beneath the hatch. Then Clara's voice returned, weak, frightened. Evelyn! Evelyn dropped to her knees beside the iron door immediately. Clara? Lucas grabbed her shoulder hard. No, but the crying below sounded heartbreakingly real now. I'm cold. Evelyn's chest tightened violently. Arthur whispered, It copies grief. Margaret shook her head slowly. No. Everyone looked at her. The older woman stared at the hatch with hollow eyes. It learned grief from us. Silence. Rain moved across the greenhouse glass like waves. Then the deeper voice spoke again beneath Clara's. She remembers. The hatch bolts suddenly snapped open. All four of them jumped backward as iron screamed against stone. The chamber door lifted 1 inch by itself. Cold air exploded upward from below, not normal cold, dead cold. The smell followed immediately. Wet earth, rot, ancient water trapped underground for centuries, and beneath it lavender. Evelyn stared in horror. My mother was here. Arthur looked shattered. She came back after the fire. The hatch slowly opened wider. Darkness waited below, stone stairs descending into blackness beneath the greenhouse, and faintly candlelight flickered somewhere far underground. Lucas lifted the lantern. We close it. The deeper voice laughed softly again. You already opened it. The greenhouse floor trembled violently. Outside, thunder cracked over Blackwater, and all across the village below, lights began going out, one house at a time, darkness swallowing the town street by street. Margaret whispered, It's spreading underground. Arthur grabbed the lantern from Lucas suddenly. There's no time left. Then before anyone could stop him, he descended into the chamber. Arthur! Margaret shouted. He didn't look back. The lantern glow vanished slowly beneath the earth. Evelyn heard his footsteps descending deeper underground, then silence. Lucas cursed sharply. He's lost his mind. But Evelyn already knew where this was going, and despite the terror flooding through her body, she couldn't stop herself. Because somewhere below that chamber, answers waited. About Clara, about her mother, about herself. And perhaps worst of all, part of her wanted to see what had called to her family all these years. She stepped toward the stairs. Lucas blocked her instantly. No, move. I mean it. So do I. Rain thundered above them while the hatch breathed cold air around their feet. Lucas looked furious now, and afraid, truly afraid. You go down there, you may not come back. Evelyn stared at him quietly. I already came back. That hurt him. She saw it instantly. 15 years of abandonment flickering behind his eyes again, but beneath the anger, love still lived there. That frightened her too. Margaret spoke softly behind them. Evelyn, she turned. Margaret looked exhausted, broken, and deeply guilty. There's something Arthur never told you. Lucas muttered bitterly, Apparently that's everyone tonight. Margaret ignored him, then looked directly at Evelyn. The remains buried beside your mother were Clara's. Cold silence settled instantly. Evelyn's throat tightened. What? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. They were your father's. The world tilted violently. No. Margaret nodded shakily. We found him below the chamber after the fire. Evelyn staggered backward. Lucas caught her immediately. Arthur's words returned suddenly. We never found the parents, except they had. Her father had died beneath Blackwood. somehow trapped below the greenhouse, and everyone lied about it. Rage hit Evelyn so suddenly it burned through fear. "You buried him beneath her grave?" Margaret whispered. "We didn't know what else to do." The hatch below them groaned louder. Something moving deeper underground, something enormous. Then Clara's voice rose softly again. "Please come downstairs." Evelyn looked toward the chamber and suddenly remembered another fragment. Her father carrying Clara through the greenhouse during the storm, the little girl crying, something following them beneath the floor, then her father shouting at Alina, "Close the door!" The memory shattered violently. Evelyn looked at Margaret. "My father trapped it down there." Margaret went silent. Answered everything. Lucas looked between them sharply. What trapped what? Evelyn stared into the darkness below and finally understood the truth. The thing beneath Blackwood had not been imprisoned centuries ago. It had been fed, over and over, generation after generation. The chamber wasn't a prison, it was an altar. A low groaning sound echoed upward from the darkness below, then footsteps. Arthur climbing back toward them slowly, one step at a time. Lucas lifted the lantern carefully. Arthur emerged from the darkness moments later, except something was wrong, very wrong. His clothes were soaked, not with rain, with black water. His face looked pale as bone, and his eyes were completely black. Margaret whispered in horror, "No." Arthur smiled softly, then spoke in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. "She remembers us now." The altar beneath the sea Lucas shoved Evelyn backward the instant Arthur spoke. The lantern light trembled violently across the greenhouse walls while rain hammered overhead. Arthur stood motionless at the top of the chamber stairs. Black water dripped steadily from his coat onto the stone floor. His smile looked wrong, too still, too peaceful. Margaret stared at him in horror. "Arthur?" He tilted his head slightly toward her. Not human, not entirely. She waited a very long time. Lucas raised the fireplace poker slowly. "What did you do down there?" Arthur's black eyes moved toward him calmly. "We opened the door." The greenhouse temperature dropped sharply. Frost spread slowly across the remaining glass overhead. Evelyn's pulse thundered painfully, because beneath Arthur's altered voice she could still hear traces of the man himself, buried deep, drowning. Margaret stepped forward shakily. "Fight it!" Arthur smiled sadly. "You still think this is possession." His voice echoed strangely now, like more than one person speaking beneath the words. Lucas whispered sharply, "Evelyn, move." But she couldn't stop staring at Arthur, or whatever stood inside him now. "You said the chamber held a family," she whispered. Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes." "Who were they?" The black eyes blinked once, too slowly. Then Arthur answered in that layered voice. "The first ones abandoned beneath the sea." Rain crashed violently against the greenhouse. The hatch behind Arthur groaned wider open, and for one terrible moment Evelyn heard waves below, not underground rivers. An ocean, massive, endless, impossible beneath the cliffs. Lucas stepped forward carefully. "You're not Arthur anymore." The thing inside Arthur looked toward him. "No," it agreed softly. Then Arthur's body suddenly convulsed violently. His mouth opened too wide. Black seawater poured from between his teeth onto the greenhouse floor. Margaret screamed. Lucas lunged forward too late. Arthur collapsed backward into the open hatch, vanishing into darkness below. His scream echoed upward only briefly before abruptly cutting off. Silence followed, except for the rain, and somewhere deep underground, something enormous moving slowly beneath Blackwater. They should have run. Every rational instinct screamed it, but Evelyn moved toward the hatch instead, because Arthur's final words had unlocked something terrible in her memory. Not images this time, understanding. The thing beneath Blackwood was old, older than the village, older than the church, older even than the tunnels. And somehow her family had become tied to it long before Clara was born. Lucas grabbed her arm sharply. No, she looked at him, and for the first time since returning to Blackwater, he looked truly terrified, not for himself, for her. If you go down there, his voice tightened painfully, you won't come back. Evelyn swallowed hard. My father died down there. So let the dead stay dead. That hurt, because beneath the anger was desperation. 15 years ago, he'd already lost her once. Now he was watching it happen again. Margaret sank weakly against the greenhouse wall, clutching her wounded arm. It wants Evelyn below the chamber. Lucas rounded on her furiously. Then why are we still standing here? Margaret looked exhausted. Because if it reaches the surface fully, Blackwater dies. And if Evelyn goes down there? Margaret's silence answered enough. The greenhouse lights flickered suddenly. Then all at once, every candle extinguished. Darkness swallowed the room except for faint blue light rising from the open hatch below. Cold mist drifted upward around them, and Clara's voice echoed softly from the darkness. Please! Evelyn stepped toward the stairs. Lucas blocked her again. She finally snapped. Stop treating me like I'm fragile. I'm treating you like you matter. Silence crashed between them. Rain, breathing, the terrible blue light rising from underground. Lucas looked away first, pain flickering openly across his face now. You left without a word, he whispered, and I spent 15 years wondering if I meant anything to you at all. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. This isn't the time. It's the only time. The honesty in his voice nearly broke her. Margaret looked down quietly, giving them privacy in the middle of horror. Lucas stepped closer. If you go down there because you think you owe Blackwood something, his voice shook slightly, then it wins. For one unbearable moment, Evelyn almost stayed, almost chose him, a normal life, a future outside this nightmare. Then Clara screamed below them, not manipulation, real pain, and Evelyn knew immediately her sister was still down there somewhere. Lucas saw the decision in her eyes. The devastation that crossed his face afterward nearly stopped her, but only nearly. She touched his hand once softly, then descended into the chamber. The stairs spiraled far deeper than Evelyn expected. Stone walls curved tightly around her while blue light pulsed faintly from somewhere below. Lucas followed despite everything. Margaret came last, breathing heavily. The air changed the deeper they descended. Wet, heavy, salt water beneath centuries of earth, and voices. Hundreds of whispers drifting through the stone around them. Fragments of memories, names, prayers, screams. Evelyn heard her mother crying somewhere nearby, heard Clara laughing, heard herself as a child whispering beneath blankets during storms. The chamber below Blackwood wasn't just underground, it remembered people. The staircase finally opened into something vast. Evelyn stopped breathing. An enormous cavern stretched beneath the cliffs. Black seawater moved slowly below stone platforms carved into the rock centuries ago. Ruined pillars rose from the water like broken teeth. Ancient symbols covered the walls, and at the center stood an altar. Massive, circular, carved directly into stone. The blue light pulsed beneath it rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Lucas whispered, "What is this place?" Margaret looked shattered. "The old settlement." "No, not settlement, temple." Evelyn felt it immediately. The carvings surrounding the altar depicted people kneeling before a dark shape rising from the sea, offering children, offering blood, offering themselves. The chamber beneath Blackwood had never imprisoned anything. It worshipped it. Then Evelyn saw Clara, standing barefoot near the altar edge. Not the child, the older version, pale, thin, watching quietly across the cavern, and beside her stood Arthur, or what remained of him. Blackwater streamed continuously from his mouth now, his eyes entirely consumed by darkness. Lucas stepped protectively in front of Evelyn. Clara smiled sadly. "You came back." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Are you really Clara?" The young woman tilted her head slightly. "Yes." Lucas whispered sharply. "No, she is." But Clara looked at Evelyn with devastating familiarity. The same nervous habit of twisting fingers together, the same sadness around the eyes. Memories surfaced violently again. Two girls hiding together during storms. Clara whispering stories in the dark. Clara listening beneath floorboards. And then Clara standing alone beneath the greenhouse after the fire while everyone else fled. Abandoned, forgotten. Evelyn stepped forward slowly. "What happened to you?" Clara's expression trembled for the first time. "They left me with him." The black seawater below the cavern suddenly moved, a massive shape shifting beneath the surface. Far too large, far too deep. Lucas grabbed Evelyn hard. "We're leaving, now." Then the water rose, not splashing, lifting. A shape emerging slowly from beneath the cavern depths. And somewhere inside the darkness beneath the water, something opened its eyes. The shape beneath the water, the cavern went silent. Even the whispers inside the walls stopped. Black seawater rolled slowly across the ancient chamber while something enormous moved beneath the surface. Not swimming, rising. Evelyn felt the vibration through the stone beneath her feet. Ancient, patient, awake. Lucas pulled her backward instinctively. "We go." But no one moved because Clara was staring into the water with tears in her eyes, not fear, recognition. Arthur, or the thing wearing Arthur's body, stepped closer to the altar edge. Black water streamed continuously from his mouth now, pooling around his shoes. "It remembers the bloodline," he whispered. His voice layered strangely against the cavern walls, many voices speaking together beneath one mouth. Margaret looked sick. "It's fully awake." The water bulged upward near the altar, a shape pressing slowly beneath the surface from below. Evelyn's pulse hammered painfully. She expected something monstrous. Tentacles, teeth, a creature. Instead, a hand emerged. Human, pale. Far too large. Blackwater pawed from its fingertips as it gripped the edge of the altar stone. Then another hand rose beside it, and slowly something began pulling itself upward from the sea beneath Blackwood. Lucas whispered, "Oh God!" The thing looked almost like a man, almost, but stretched wrong somehow. Too tall, limbs unnaturally long beneath skin pale as drowned flesh. Its body looked ancient. Not rotting, preserved, eyes closed, black water streaming endlessly down its face. And carved across its chest, the same symbols covering the chamber walls. Evelyn couldn't breathe. The figure climbed fully onto the altar platform and stood motionless in the blue light. Ancient water pooled around its bare feet, then slowly its eyes opened, entirely black. The cavern temperature dropped instantly. Lucas pulled Evelyn farther behind him, but the thing never looked at Lucas, or Margaret, or Arthur. It looked only at Evelyn and smiled softly, like someone recognizing family. Clara whispered, "He remembers her." Evelyn's stomach turned violently. "What is it?" Arthur answered in that layered voice. "The first father." Silence. Margaret stared at him in horror. "You said the settlement worshipped it." Arthur nodded slowly. "They called him the Tidekeeper." The ancient figure tilted its head slightly toward Evelyn, studying her, not with hunger, with grief. Then it spoke. Its voice sounded like deep water moving through caves. "Elena!" Evelyn's blood froze. Lucas stepped forward immediately. "She's not Elena." The figure blinked slowly, then its gaze sharpened, and suddenly the entire cavern trembled. Whispers erupted through the walls again, hundreds of voices screaming all at once. The Tidekeeper looked confused, almost distressed. Clara moved carefully toward Evelyn. "He mistakes us." Lucas raised the fireplace poker defensively. "You stay away from her." Clara ignored him, her gray eyes locked onto Evelyn S. "You left me here." Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. "I was a child." "So was I," that landed like a knife because it was true. Clara stepped closer, and now Evelyn saw it clearly. The resemblance wasn't exact anymore because years underground had changed Clara somehow. But beneath the pallor, beneath the blackness creeping slowly through her veins, she was still her sister. Still human, at least partly. Evelyn whispered, "What did it do to you?" Clara looked toward the Tidekeeper standing silently beside the altar. "He kept me alive." The way she said it sounded both grateful and horrified. Margaret shook her head. "No," Clara looked toward her calmly, "you all abandoned me." Arthur suddenly collapsed to his knees beside the altar, violently coughing seawater onto the stone. The thing inside him was failing, or losing control. Lucas looked toward the chamber entrance urgently. "This place is coming apart." He was right. Cracks spread slowly through the cavern walls now. Blackwater surged higher around the altar. The village above was collapsing inward, Blackwater itself sinking toward the sea beneath it. The Tidekeeper finally moved again, one slow step toward Evelyn. The cavern shook harder instantly. Whispers screamed louder. Memories exploded through Evelyn's mind all at once. Centuries of people kneeling before the sea chamber, offering children during storms, burying grief underground, feeding something ancient beneath the cliffs. And then Elena standing before the altar 20 years earlier, holding Clara, begging, the Tidekeeper reaching toward the child gently. Evelyn gasped sharply. It hadn't taken Clara, her mother had brought her here. Lucas caught Evelyn before she fell. "What's happening?" Evelyn struggled to breathe. "My mother brought Clara below the chamber willingly." Margaret closed her eyes. "Yes." The betrayal hit like physical pain. "No." Margaret's voice broke. Clara was dying. Silence. Evelyn stared at her. "What?" Arthur coughed violently beside the altar, then whispered weakly, "The fever." Margaret nodded through tears. She was already dying before the fire. The cavern blurred around Evelyn. Childhood memories twisted suddenly into clarity, doctors visiting the manor, Clara coughing blood into handkerchiefs, her mother crying alone at night. Elena hadn't sacrificed Clara, she had tried to save her. The Tidekeeper stepped closer again, and now Evelyn understood the terrible truth. It had healed Clara, but healing came with a cost. Clara whispered softly, "It doesn't understand death." The ancient figure tilted its head toward her voice. almost childlike confusion crossing its face. Evelyn stared at it in horror. It wasn't evil. Not completely. It simply didn't understand human endings. Loss, mortality. It preserved things instead. Forever. Arthur suddenly screamed. His body convulsed violently beside the altar. Black cracks spread across his skin. The tidekeeper looked toward him slowly, then toward Evelyn again, waiting, expecting something. Clara whispered urgently, "It wants another promise." Lucas stepped backward immediately. "No," Margaret looked horrified. "That's how the settlement survived." Evelyn's pulse thundered painfully. "What promise?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It keeps what you ask it to keep." The chamber shook violently. Stone collapsed into the Blackwater nearby. Blackwater village above them was dying. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's face firmly. "Listen to me." His voice shook now. "You don't owe this place your life." Evelyn looked at him, and for one terrible moment she realized exactly what the tidekeeper wanted. Not sacrifice, not death, continuation. Bloodline, memory, someone to remain below the chamber and remember the forgotten. Clara stepped closer. "You can end this." Evelyn whispered. "How?" Clara looked heartbreakingly tired. "By letting me die." The cavern fell silent. Even the tidekeeper stopped moving. The black-eyed figure stared at Clara in confusion, like the idea itself made no sense. Lucas immediately shook his head. "There has to be another way." Clara smiled sadly. "No." Then she looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, not as prey, not as family returned, as a sister. "I'm so tired." The promise Elena made the cavern trembled harder now. Stone cracked above the black water while ancient pillars groaned beneath the shifting weight of the cliffs. Blackwater was collapsing, not dramatically, slowly, like the village had finally begun sinking back into the sea that birthed it centuries ago, and at the center of everything, Clara stood waiting. Tired, human. Evelyn stared at her sister through the flickering blue light and realized something unbearable. Clara had spent 20 years trapped between life and death, not alive, not gone, preserved. Remembered, kept, because someone beneath Blackwood did not understand how to let go. Lucas moved closer to Evelyn protectively. "You don't have to decide anything right now." Clara's eyes softened at him. "You still love her." Lucas looked startled, then angry. "You don't get to talk about things you don't understand." Clara smiled sadly. "I understand more than you think." Arthur screamed again beside the altar. His body convulsed violently against the stone floor as black seawater flooded from his mouth. The tidekeeper finally looked toward him, not with cruelty, with disappointment, like something precious breaking. Margaret rushed toward Arthur instinctively despite everything. "Arthur!" He grabbed her wrist suddenly. Hard, his blackened eyes flickered weakly toward her, and for one brief second the real Arthur surfaced again. "Seal!" He choked painfully. More black water poured from his mouth. "Seal the chamber!" Margaret's face crumpled. "How?" Arthur's gaze drifted toward Evelyn. "The bloodline?" The tidekeeper turned slowly back toward Evelyn again, waiting, ancient black eyes fixed gently on her face. Evelyn suddenly remembered another memory in full, not fragmented this time, complete, the greenhouse, the night of the fire, rain hammering against glass. Elena kneeling before the chamber stairs holding Clara tightly. The child burning with fever, barely breathing. Arthur shouting from behind, "Elena, stop!" But her mother descended anyway, carrying Clara into the darkness below. Evelyn remembered following secretly behind, hiding halfway down the staircase. Watching, the chamber glowed blue beneath the sea cavern. The tidekeeper stood beside the altar, silent, watching Alina approach, and Alina whispered through tears, "Please." Not fear, desperation, a mother begging. Clara coughed weakly against her chest. The tidekeeper touched the child's forehead gently. The fever vanished instantly. Evelyn remembered her mother sobbing in relief. Then the tidekeeper spoke softly, "She will remain." Alina froze. "What?" The tidekeeper repeated calmly, "She will remain below the water." Alina clutched Clara tighter. "No." The chamber shook violently. The tidekeeper stepped closer. "She belongs to the promise now." Arthur rushed down the stairs then, grabbing Alina's arm. "Take Evelyn and run." And suddenly fire exploded through the greenhouse overhead. The memory shattered. Evelyn staggered backward into Lucas's chest, gasping for breath. He held her immediately. "What happened?" Tears burned down her face now. "My mother tried to save her." Margaret closed her eyes painfully. "Yes, she didn't abandon Clara." "No." Evelyn looked toward the tidekeeper standing silently near the altar. "You took her." The ancient figure tilted its head slightly, confused, then answered in that deep water voice, "She was kept." Not malicious. Certain. Evelyn understood then. The tidekeeper believed preservation was mercy, keeping people from death, from endings, from grief. It didn't understand that endless existence could become its own kind of horror. Clara whispered softly, "It never meant to hurt anyone." Lucas muttered, "That doesn't make this okay." The cavern trembled violently again. Stone collapsed into the water nearby with a massive crash. Above them, Blackwood Manor groaned like a dying ship. Margaret looked toward the ceiling in panic. "The village is falling." Arthur coughed weakly beside the altar. "The chamber's unstable." Clara stepped toward Evelyn slowly. "Please." Tears filled her eyes now. Real tears, human tears. "I can't stay here anymore." Evelyn's throat closed painfully. "What happens if you leave?" Clara looked toward the tidekeeper, and for the first time fear crossed her face. "It follows." Silence. The tidekeeper watched them quietly, not understanding, waiting for the promise to continue. Lucas stepped forward carefully. "What if the chamber's destroyed?" Arthur whispered hoarsely. "The cliffs collapse." Margaret looked horrified. "The entire coastline?" "Yes." There was no escape left, no clean ending, only choices between terrible things. Evelyn looked at Clara, at her sister who should have died 20 years ago, at the grief buried beneath Blackwood Manor, at the loneliness stretched across decades underground, and finally asked the question haunting her since the beginning. "Why me?" Clara's expression broke softly. "Because you forgot me." The honesty of it nearly destroyed her. "I didn't know." "I know." Clara stepped closer, only inches away now, and suddenly Evelyn saw the child she once loved hidden beneath the strange pale face, still there, still waiting. Clara lifted trembling fingers toward Evelyn's cheek, cold skin, almost human warmth beneath it. "You were supposed to remember for both of us." The tidekeeper moved suddenly. The cavern shook harder instantly. Black water surged across the altar steps. Arthur screamed again, his body beginning to split beneath the thing controlling him. The tidekeeper looked distressed now, confused by Clara's grief, confused by endings, confused by loss. Then it spoke directly to Evelyn. "Choose." The single word echoed through the chamber like thunder, and somehow Evelyn understood exactly what it meant. Continue the promise. Remain below Blackwood. Preserve Clara. Preserve the bloodline. I'll let the chamber collapse and end everything buried beneath the sea. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's hand tightly. We leave together. Clara smiled sadly at that. You still think there's a together after this? Evelyn looked between them both. The man she once loved, the sister she lost, and beneath it all, the unbearable weight of her mother's choice. Elena hadn't failed. She had been trapped exactly where Evelyn stood now, forced to choose between impossible griefs. Another massive crack split through the cavern ceiling. Seawater burst downward violently. Margaret shouted, "The cliffs are giving way!" The tidekeeper raised one pale hand slowly toward Evelyn, waiting, offering, and Clara whispered through tears, "Please let me go." The lost daughter of Blackwood, the cavern began collapsing in earnest. Stone rained into the black water around the altar, while ancient pillars cracked beneath the pressure of the sea above them. The tidekeeper remained motionless at the center of it all. One pale hand still extended toward Evelyn, waiting, not threatening, expecting, because for centuries someone had always accepted the promise. Someone had always chosen preservation over loss. Evelyn finally understood the true horror of Blackwood, not monsters, not curses, grief, generations of people unable to let go. The tidekeeper had survived because human beings could not bear endings. And now it stood before the lost daughter of Blackwood Manor, asking the same impossible thing it asked Elena 20 years earlier: keep her or lose her forever. Lucas tightened his grip around Evelyn's hand. We go now. Clara looked at him sadly. If she leaves without ending this, her voice trembled. It won't stop. Arthur screamed again behind them. His body slammed violently against the altar stone as black fractures spread across his skin. The tidekeeper barely glanced toward him. Already losing interest in the vessel it used, Margaret knelt beside Arthur helplessly. Tears streamed down her face. Stay with me. Arthur's remaining human eye found Evelyn weakly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked honest, truly honest. I'm sorry. The chamber shook violently again. Black water surged over the altar steps. The village above groaned like a dying ship. Evelyn looked toward Clara. You said I can end this. Clara nodded slowly. But you won't like how. The tidekeeper's dark eyes remained fixed on Evelyn, waiting patiently, ancient, unchanging. Evelyn stepped toward Clara despite Lucas trying to stop her. What happens if I accept the promise? Clara closed her eyes briefly. It keeps me alive. And me? A long silence followed. Then Clara whispered, You stay with us. Us, not me, us. The realization hit like ice. The tidekeeper wasn't alone below Blackwood. Never had been. The voices inside the walls. The whispers, the memories trapped underground, all the people preserved beneath grief and seawater for centuries, waiting, remembering. Evelyn suddenly understood why the chamber beneath Blackwood had sounded crowded. It was. Lucas saw the horror spread across her face. What is it? Evelyn whispered numbly. There are others down here. Clara nodded once. So many. The black water moved around the altar suddenly. Shapes surfaced briefly beneath the waves. Faces. Human faces just beneath the surface. Eyes open. Watching, hundreds of them. Lucas cursed under his breath. We're done here. He pulled Evelyn backward sharply. But the tidekeeper moved instantly. Not attacking, simply appearing between them, too fast. The ancient figure stood inches away now, towering, black water dripping endlessly from pale skin, and for the first time Evelyn saw sorrow in its eyes, not evil, not rage, loneliness older than memory itself. The tidekeeper touched her face gently, ice-cold fingers against her skin, and suddenly Evelyn saw everything. A coastline centuries earlier, storms swallowing entire villages, families starving through endless winters, children dying faster than they could be buried, and beneath the cliffs, a man discovering something impossible inside the sea caves, a force that could preserve life, prevent death, keep loved ones from disappearing forever. At first it looked like mercy. Parents bringing dying children below the cliffs, lovers begging for more time, the tidekeeper granting preservation freely, but preserved life was not living. The kept ones changed slowly over years underground, memories fading, humanity thinning, loneliness deepening into madness, yet the villages continued returning, because grief always returned too, and eventually the tidekeeper forgot why humans feared eternity at all. The vision shattered violently. Evelyn gasped for breath. The tidekeeper stepped backward slightly, watching her carefully now, as if hoping she finally understood, and she did, perfectly. It was not a monster, it was grief without end. Clara whispered softly, "It doesn't know how to say goodbye." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. Neither did she, not really. She spent 15 years running from Blackwood because leaving had been easier than mourning, easier than remembering, easier than accepting loss. Lucas stepped closer carefully. "Evelyn." She looked at him and suddenly knew with devastating certainty what her mother failed to do. Elena tried to destroy the chamber through fear, but fear never ended grief, only acceptance could. The tidekeeper extended its hand once more, offering preservation, offering memory without endings. And Evelyn finally answered softly, "No." The chamber went silent. Even the collapsing stone seemed to pause. The tidekeeper stared at her, confused, hurt. Evelyn stepped toward Clara slowly. Hands trembling, "You deserve to live," she whispered. Clara's eyes filled with tears, "But you didn't." The words shattered something inside the cavern. The tidekeeper recoiled slightly. Like pain, real pain, Evelyn held Clara's face gently between her hands. "You were sick," she whispered through tears, "and Mom couldn't lose you." Clara sobbed softly now, for the first time sounding fully human. "I was so scared." "I know." The chamber trembled harder. The black water began retreating violently from the altar, the faces beneath the surface screaming soundlessly now. The tidekeeper stepped backward again, its form flickering strangely. Weakening, Evelyn understood suddenly. The chamber fed on denial, on unfinished grief, on people unable to let go, and for the first time in centuries, someone finally was. Clara looked terrified now. "What's happening?" Evelyn pulled her into an embrace immediately. "Cold, fragile, real. You can rest now." The tidekeeper screamed, a sound so ancient and heartbroken it shook the entire cavern apart. Arthur's body collapsed instantly beside the altar. "Freed," Margaret cried out. The black water surged upward violently around the chamber. The preserved faces beneath the surface began dissolving one by one into darkness. Lucas shouted, "The cave's collapsing!" Stone exploded from the ceiling overhead. Seawater burst through massive fractures in the cliffs. The tidekeeper staggered toward Evelyn desperately. Not angry, begging, "Please don't leave me alone." Evelyn saw it clearly in those black ancient eyes, an endless creature abandoned by time itself. Clara looked toward it through tears, then whispered softly, "Goodbye." The tidekeeper stopped moving. Its expression changed. Confusion first, then understanding, and finally grief, true grief, for the very first time. The ancient figure slowly sank backward into the black water, still watching Clara, watching Evelyn, watching the promise finally end. Then the sea swallowed it whole. The cavern began dying around them instantly. Lucas grabbed Evelyn and Clara both. "We have to go now." But Clara remained standing still beside the collapsing altar, the blue light fading rapidly around her, her skin already beginning to pale further, transparent. Evelyn's breath caught painfully. "No," Clara smiled softly, peacefully this time. "It's okay." Stone crashed violently around them. Margaret dragged the unconscious Arthur toward the stairs. Lucas looked at Evelyn desperately. "We have seconds." Clara touched Evelyn's cheek gently. "You remembered me." Tears blurred Evelyn's vision completely now. "I'm sorry." Clara smiled through tears of her own. "I know." And then her body dissolved into black seawater beneath Evelyn's hands. "The sea takes Blackwater," Evelyn screamed, not loudly, not theatrically. A broken sound torn from somewhere deep inside her chest as Clara vanished between her fingers like water slipping through open hands. 1 second she was there, cold skin, gray eyes, human grief, and the next only black seawater remained spreading slowly across the altar stone. The cavern shook violently. Lucas grabbed Evelyn around the waist before collapsing debris crushed them both. "We have to move." But Evelyn couldn't stop staring at the water where Clara had stood. Gone. Really gone this time. No chamber preserving her. No underground whispers. No endless half-life beneath Blackwood. Gone. And somehow that felt more merciful than terrifying. The cavern's ceiling split apart overhead. Massive cracks raced through ancient stone while seawater exploded downward from the cliffs above. The sea was reclaiming everything. Margaret struggled desperately to pull Arthur toward the staircase while unconscious bodies floated briefly beneath the black water around the altar. The preserved dead. Finally released, the tidekeeper was gone, and without it, the entire chamber was collapsing into the ocean beneath Blackwater. Lucas dragged Evelyn toward the stairs. Now, this time she followed, because there was nothing left to hold onto underground, only grief, and finally an ending. The staircase behind the greenhouse erupted as they climbed. Stone shattered beneath waves crashing through the collapsing chamber below. Arthur regained consciousness halfway up the stairs, weak, barely breathing. Margaret nearly collapsed in relief when he opened his eyes. "You're alive." Arthur looked dazed, like someone waking from years underwater. Then horror crossed his face. "Where's Clara?" Evelyn looked away. That answer alone shattered him. The greenhouse above groaned violently when they finally burst back into the storm. Blackwood Manor was dying. Windows shattered inward from pressure beneath the cliffs. The entire estate leaned dangerously toward the sea now as the earth underneath it collapsed. Rain and seawater flooded the greenhouse floor. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's hand tightly. "We run downhill." But Blackwater below them looked even worse. The village streets were flooding rapidly as sections of the cliffside gave way beneath buildings. Church bells rang wildly in the distance. People screamed through the fog. The sea had reached the town. Arthur stared toward the collapsing manor in numb horror. "All these years," Margaret whispered softly, "it's over." "No, not over yet." Because as Evelyn looked toward Blackwood one final time, she saw movement in an upstairs window. A figure standing silently behind the glass. A child, watching the storm, watching her. Clara, no, not Clara, only memory. The image vanished with the next lightning strike, and then the third floor collapsed entirely into darkness. Blackwood Manor finally began falling into the sea. The village evacuation became chaos. Fishermen dragged families uphill through flooded streets while church bells continued screaming over the storm. Some people were praying, some simply running. Others stood motionless in the rain, staring toward the cliffs where Blackwood collapsed piece by piece into the ocean, like they couldn't understand what they were seeing, or perhaps always feared this day would come. Lucas helped Maggie Holt carry injured villagers toward the church hill, while emergency sirens echoed faintly from distant coastal roads. The fog finally began lifting, not naturally, like something breathing beneath Blackwater had finally stopped. Evelyn stood near the cemetery watching the manor disappear. Stone, glass, memory, all sinking slowly into the raging sea. Arthur approached beside her carefully. He looked older now, truly old. The blackness was gone from his eyes, only exhaustion remained. "She's gone," he whispered. Evelyn nodded slowly. Rain streaked down her face unnoticed. Arthur swallowed painfully. "I thought preserving people meant saving them." Evelyn looked toward the sea. "My mother thought so too." Silence stretched between them. Then Arthur whispered, "I loved her." The confession surprised her less than it should have. Evelyn looked at him quietly. "She loved my father." Arthur nodded once. "I know." That hurt him still, even after all these years. Another kind of grief Blackwood never released. Below them, a final section of Blackwood Manor collapsed violently into the sea. The greenhouse vanished next. Then the cliffs themselves gave way, everything swallowed by dark water and storm. The house that haunted generations disappeared beneath the ocean completely, and for the first time since returning to Blackwater, the whispers stopped. Complete silence spread through the rain, no voices, no crying beneath the earth. Nothing. Evelyn closed her eyes and suddenly realized something strange. The grief remained, but the fear was gone. Morning arrived slowly over the coast. Gray sunlight spread across the damaged village while emergency crews moved through flooded streets below. The storm had passed during dawn. Only rough waves remained now crashing against ruined sections of cliffside where Blackwood Manor once stood. Nothing remained of it, not even rubble visible above the sea, as if the house had never existed at all. Evelyn sat alone near the cemetery wall, wrapped in a wool blanket Maggie had fossed around her shoulders hours earlier. She hadn't slept. None of them had. Lucas approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her quietly before sitting beside her overlooking the coast. For several minutes neither spoke. Only gulls crying over the sea below, normal sounds, human sounds. Finally, Lucas said softly, "You stayed." Evelyn stared into the coffee steam rising between her hands. "Yes, you could have left years ago without looking back." "I tried." Lucas looked at her carefully. "And now?" Evelyn thought about Clara. About Alina, about the tidekeeper alone beneath centuries of grief, then quietly answered, "I think some things follow you until you face them." Lucas smiled faintly. "Tired, sad, sounds like something your mother would say." Evelyn almost smiled too, almost. Then Maggie appeared climbing the cemetery hill toward them. Her face looked pale, concerned. "Evelyn," Something in her voice immediately tightened the air. Lucas stood. "What happened?" Maggie hesitated, then held out something wrapped in cloth. Small. "Water damaged." Evelyn took it carefully, unwrapped the fabric slowly. Inside rested a child's silver bracelet blackened by seawater, tiny engraved initials still visible beneath the corrosion. C.M. Clara Marrow. Evelyn stopped breathing. Maggie whispered softly, "A fisherman found it this morning." Silence settled heavily across the cemetery. Evelyn turned the bracelet over in trembling fingers, then froze. There was something else engraved inside the metal. Words too faint to notice before. She lifted it closer and felt cold spread slowly through her chest, because scratched carefully into the inner silver in tiny, uneven handwriting were 4 words. "She still hears him." The house beneath the waves. 3 weeks later, Blackwater pretended to be alive again. The harbor reopened first, then the bakery, then the church, though half the stained glass windows remained boarded over after the collapse. People spoke quietly now, moved carefully. Like survivors after a fire who feared stepping too hard across weakened floors. No one mentioned Blackwood Manor directly, not in public. Official reports blamed the disaster on coastal erosion and storm damage. The cliffs were unstable, the manor old, the tunnels beneath the coastline unsafe for decades. Simple explanations, necessary lies. Blackwater had always survived through silence. But at night, the village still listened, just in case. Evelyn remained longer than she intended. Longer than she admitted to herself. Partly because roads near the cliffs stayed closed. Mostly because leaving now felt impossible. Not out of fear anymore. Responsibility. The dead deserved remembering properly. Especially Clara. Especially Alina. Especially the countless unnamed voices buried beneath Blackwater for centuries. So Evelyn stayed. She rented the room above Maggie's diner, helped sort damaged church records during the day. And every evening around sunset, she walked the coastline where Blackwood Manor once stood. The sea had swallowed everything. No ruins remained visible above the water. Only jagged waves crashing endlessly against black rocks below the cliffs. Yet sometimes, especially near dusk, Evelyn still felt watched there. Not threatened, observed, as though memory itself lingered beneath the sea. Lucas hated when she walked alone, which meant he usually followed her anyway. Tonight was no different. "You know Maggie thinks you're haunting the cliffs now." Evelyn glanced sideways as Lucas approached through the fog carrying 2 cups of tea. The wind moved softly through his dark coat. He looked older than when she first returned. So did she. Some grief-aged people quietly. Evelyn accepted the tea. "Maybe I am." Lucas stood beside her overlooking the sea. For a while they simply listened to the waves. No whispers anymore. No voices underground. Only water. Natural water. It still felt miraculous. Lucas finally spoke softly. "Arthur's leaving tomorrow." Evelyn nodded once. After surviving the collapse, Arthur Vale had confessed everything to investigators willing to listen. Most thought trauma had broken his mind. Perhaps it had. Margaret planned to stay in Blackwater. Arthur could not. Some ghosts remained too close here. "He asked about you," Lucas continued carefully. "What did you tell him?" "That you'd answer when ready." Evelyn stared at the sea. "I'm not angry anymore." Lucas looked surprised. "You should be." "I know." But anger felt smaller now somehow, smaller than grief, smaller than understanding. Arthur spent decades trying to preserve what should have been mourned. The Tidekeeper merely reflected humanity's oldest weakness back at itself, the refusal to let go. Lucas leaned against the cliff railing beside her. "And what about us?" There it was, finally, the question waiting between them since the train station. Evelyn looked down into her untouched tea. Rain clouds drifted low over the horizon. The world smelled like salt and cold stone. "I don't know how to return to who I was before this." Lucas nodded slowly. "I figured. That scares you?" "No," he smiled faintly. "It scares me how much I still want to try anyway." The honesty in his voice hurt beautifully. Evelyn looked at him then, really looked, at the patience he never lost, at the sadness he carried quietly all these years, at the life they almost had before Blackwood destroyed everything. And softly she asked, "Why didn't you leave?" Lucas stared toward the sea. "Because someone had to remember what happened here." The answer nearly broke her heart. Before she could respond, something moved below the cliffs. Both of them froze instantly. Far beneath the waterline, a pale shape drifted briefly beneath the waves, then vanished. Lucas gripped the railing tightly. "You saw that?" Evelyn's pulse quickened painfully. "Yes." Silence. Then another wave crashed against the rocks. Nothing remained afterward. Probably debris, probably imagination, probably. Yet Evelyn's fingers unconsciously tightened around the silver bracelet hidden inside her coat pocket. She still hears him. The words never left her mind. That night the fog returned thick over Blackwater, dense enough to swallow entire streets whole. Evelyn couldn't sleep. Again. The room above Maggie's diner creaked softly around her while distant foghorns echoed across the bay. Near midnight, she finally gave up trying. She lit a small lamp beside the window and opened the old journal Margaret had given her earlier that evening. Evelyn Marrow's handwriting filled every page. Notes, sketches, dreams, obsessions. Most entries revolved around Clara after the fire, not searching for her, listening for her. Evelyn turned another page slowly, then froze. A sketch filled the paper entirely. The Tidekeeper, not monstrous, lonely. Standing beneath waves with dozens of pale figures surrounding it, and beneath the drawing Elena had written one sentence. It only learned love from grieving people. Evelyn stared at the words for a long time, then another sound interrupted her thoughts. 3 soft knocks against the window. Her blood turned instantly cold. Slowly, Evelyn looked upward. Fog pressed thick against the glass outside. At first, she saw nothing. Then a figure stood beyond the window in the alley below. A young woman. Dark hair moving softly in the wind, pale face tilted upward. Watching. Evelyn stopped breathing. "Clara, no, impossible." The figure smiled sadly, then lifted one hand slowly toward the fog-covered window and vanished. The alley below stood empty again. Evelyn rushed to the glass. Nothing, only drifting fog. Her pulse thundered painfully. Hallucination, grief, memory, that had to be all. Then she noticed something resting on the windowsill inside the room. Wet seawater slowly spreading beneath it. Evelyn approached carefully, hands trembling. A small object lay against the wood, an old black chess piece, a knight. She recognized it instantly. Clara's favorite piece from childhood. The room suddenly felt freezing cold. Then very softly, from somewhere far below the streets of Blackwater, Evelyn heard knocking. 3 slow impacts beneath the earth. Not loud, not violent, patient, waiting, her breath caught painfully. The sound came again, and this time she heard a voice beneath it. Deep, ancient, almost swallowed by distance and seawater, but unmistakable. Evelyn! The lamp beside her flickered once. Then darkness swallowed the room, and somewhere beneath Blackwater Bay, something moved. Full story summary: the woman who returned to Blackwood Manor follows Evelyn Marrow, a lonely and emotionally scarred woman who returns to the isolated coastal village of Blackwater after receiving a mysterious letter warning her that Blackwood Manor is not empty. What begins as a haunted house mystery slowly unfolds into a devastating psychological and supernatural family tragedy. Inside Blackwood Manor, Evelyn uncovers buried secrets about her mother Alina, her vanished father, hidden underground tunnels, and a twin sister named Clara she was manipulated into forgetting after a catastrophic fire 20 years earlier. As disappearances spread across Blackwater, Evelyn discovers that beneath the manor lies an ancient flooded chamber connected to a forgotten coastal cult and an immortal entity known as the Tidekeeper, a lonely being that preserves people from death but traps them in endless half-life beneath the sea. Clara, once a dying child saved by the Tidekeeper, has existed for decades underground between life and death, calling Evelyn back to Blackwood so someone would finally remember her. The deeper Evelyn descends into Blackwood's hidden world, the more she realizes the true horror is not evil, but grief itself. The Tidekeeper survives because humans cannot let go of the people they lose. In the final confrontation beneath the collapsing cliffs, Evelyn chooses acceptance over preservation, allowing Clara to finally die peacefully and breaking the centuries-old promise that sustained the chamber beneath Blackwater. Blackwood Manor sinks into the sea. The voices disappear. But some mysteries remain unfinished, because grief never vanishes completely, and something beneath the waves may still remember her name.